Some men are called crazy. Some men are called visionaries. The brutal truth is, nobody knows which one you are until it's already over. Caleb Thornton stood in the middle of a dead field, 6 rusted tractors rotting behind him like metal corpses, his bank account sitting at $43, and every single person in Harlow County laughing at him behind his back. His 8-year-old son was sleeping in a farmhouse with no heat. His wife had been gone 2 years. And somewhere across the country, a woman he'd never met was about to change everything. But that part comes later. First, the fall. If this story pulls you in, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Caleb Thornton buried his wife, it rained so hard the cemetery turned to mud. He remembered standing at the gravesite with his dress shoes sinking into the soft earth, Evan pressed against his leg, the boy's small fingers wrapped around 2 of his. The pastor was saying something. People were crying. Someone had brought an umbrella and kept trying to hold it over Caleb's head, and he kept stepping out from under it without thinking, letting the rain hit him, because the rain was real and he needed something real right then. He was 30 years old. His wife, Marie, was 31. She'd been gone in 8 days. Ovarian cancer. By the time they found it, it was already everywhere. He drove home from the cemetery alone. Evan rode with Marie's mother, because Caleb had asked for 15 minutes by himself, and he sat in the parking lot of a gas station on Route 9 for 45 minutes, engine off, rain hammering the roof of the truck, not crying, not thinking, just sitting. He wasn't even sure what he was waiting for. Permission to fall apart, maybe. It never came, so he drove home. Ashab. The next 2 years were the kind of years nobody writes about because there's nothing interesting in them. There's no dramatic rock bottom moment, no single night where everything cracks open. It's just gray. An unbroken, grinding, colorless gray that starts when the alarm goes off at 5 in the morning and doesn't stop until you fall asleep watching whatever's on television, because silence is worse. Caleb worked construction during the week and took weekend shifts at a hardware store in Delwood, 12 miles east. His mother-in-law, Ruth, watched Evan on the days he couldn't arrange school pickup. He paid his bills, he fed his son, he packed lunches and signed permission slips and showed up to parent-teacher conferences and smiled at the right moments. He was functional. Functional is not the same as alive. At night, after Evan was in bed, Caleb would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before he drank it, and he'd look at nothing, just the wall. Sometimes he'd look at the chair Marie used to sit in. He stopped doing that after a while because it didn't help. He was 31 when he started sleeping more than 8 hours. He was 31 when he noticed he'd stop talking to people unless they talked to him first. Not rudely, just the impulse wasn't there anymore. Words required energy, and energy was something he was always short on. Evan noticed. Kids notice everything. "Dad," the boy said one Sunday morning, sitting across from him at breakfast, syrup on his chin, looking at Caleb with those dark, serious eyes that were exactly Marie's eyes. "Are you sad?" Caleb looked at his son. "Sometimes," he said, because he'd promised himself he wouldn't lie to the kid. Evan nodded slowly, like he was filing that information away. "Me too," he said. They ate their pancakes. That was the most honest conversation Caleb had that entire year. The farm idea didn't start as an idea. It started as a memory. When Caleb was 9 years old, his grandfather had taken him to a working farm outside of Clarksville, a place that belonged to a man named Harold Greer, who grew soy and corn and kept a few cattle. Caleb spent a weekend there. He remembered the smell of the morning, diesel and earth and something green he couldn't name. He remembered watching Harold Greer climb onto an old green tractor at 6 a.m. and move through the rows like the whole field belonged to him, because it did. He'd thought about that weekend maybe twice in 20 years. Then one Tuesday evening in March, Evan was doing a school project about farm animals and had spread papers all over the kitchen table, and Caleb was helping him glue a photo of a Holstein cow to a poster board. And something about the smell of the paste, or the picture of the animal, or the particular slant of the lamplight, something pulled that memory up from wherever it had been buried. Harold Greer on his tractor, that sense of purpose, of a man exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. Caleb stared at the poster board for a long moment. Dad? You're not helping, Evan said. Sorry. He handed the boy the glue stick. Evan, did you know your great-grandfather grew up on a farm? Really? Yeah. What did he grow? Tobacco, mostly, but also vegetables, corn. Evan considered this with the gravity that 8-year-olds apply to random facts. That's cool, he said. I think I'd like a farm. Caleb didn't say anything, but he didn't stop thinking about it either. He started looking at land listings the following week. Not seriously. The way you scroll through travel photos of places you'll never go, just to look, just to feel something for 5 minutes. Harlow County had listings. Most were priced way beyond anything he could touch. But there was one property, 63 acres on the east side of the county, off Miller Road, that had been sitting on the market for 11 months. The listing photos showed overgrown fields, a half-collapsed fence line, a farmhouse that needed serious work. The price had been cut 3 times. The real estate agent's name was Dennis Farrow. Caleb called him on a Wednesday afternoon, half expecting to be embarrassed by how far out of his price range it was. But the asking price, while still a stretch, was not impossible. Not if he liquidated his savings, took out a small business loan, and did a lot of the farmhouse repair himself. Not impossible. Deeply, profoundly, dangerously risky. But not impossible. He drove out to look at it on a Thursday. He brought Evan. The property was worse in person than the photos suggested, which was saying something because the photos had been honest about how bad it was. The access road was rutted so deeply the truck bottomed out twice. The fields were a mess of overgrown brush and volunteer weeds, chest high in some places. The farmhouse had a porch that sagged on one side and window frames swollen out of true by years of moisture. 3 of the outbuildings were unusable. The fence was down in 4 sections. Evan walked beside him through the tall grass, saying nothing, which was unusual for Evan. Caleb walked the property for an hour. He didn't speak much either, he just looked. Tried to see the shape of it under the neglect. Tried to understand what the land actually was, rather than what it looked like right now. The soil was dark where he crouched and took a handful, dense and heavy, with clay content. Not easy to work, but workable. The lay of the land was good, gentle slope, decent drainage, facing south. No major flooding risk. When they got back to the truck, Evan climbed in and buckled his seatbelt and looked at his father. It's a mess, the boy said. Yeah, Caleb agreed, but you like it. Caleb looked out at the property, the overgrown fields, the broken fence, the leaning porch. Yeah, he said again. I think I do. Evan was quiet for a moment, then, Are you going to buy it? Caleb started the truck. I'm thinking about it. I think you should, Evan said. Why? The boy shrugged, the way kids shrug when they feel something they don't have words for yet. It feels like something, he said. You know, like it's supposed to be something. Caleb put the truck in gear. Yeah, he said. That's exactly what I thought. Pasm. He bought it 6 weeks later. He signed the paperwork on a Friday afternoon in Dennis Farrow's small office in downtown Harlow, hand slightly unsteady, aware that he was doing something either very brave or very stupid, aware also that he could not clearly tell the difference right now. He came home that evening with the deed in a manila envelope and set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Then he called Ruth. I bought a farm, he said. There was a silence. You bought a... Caleb, honey, what are you talking about? 63 acres off Miller Road. I've been looking at it for weeks. The price was right. The land is solid. I think I can make something of it. Another silence, longer this time. Caleb? Ruth's voice was careful. You work construction. I know. You don't know anything about farming. I know the basics. I've been reading. You've been... She stopped. He could hear her trying to find the right words. Sweetheart, I wonder if maybe you should talk to someone, a professional, because this sounds like what? She didn't say it, but he heard it anyway. Like grief. Like a desperate man making a desperate decision because he can't figure out any other way to feel something. Maybe she was right. He'd thought about that. He'd sat with it for weeks. But there was a difference between a reckless decision and a decision that scared you. He was scared. He was also, for the first time in 2 years, awake. "I'm okay, Ruth," he said. "I appreciate the concern, really, but I'm okay." She exhaled. "Just please be careful with Evan. Whatever you decide to do with that land, just make sure it doesn't. He comes first. He always comes first." "I know he does." A pause. "You're a good father, Caleb." He thanked her and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table. He put his hand flat on the manila envelope. "Okay," he said to no one. Let's figure this out." What Caleb Thornton did not yet know, what he would not learn until later, was that 2 days after he purchased the Miller Road property, a name was mentioned in a conversation he wasn't part of. The name was his. The conversation happened in the back booth of Harlow Diner between Dennis Farrow and a man named Ray Buckley, who ran the county's largest agricultural supply company. Dennis had told the story the way men in small towns tell stories, not maliciously, just because it was interesting, and Harlow didn't generate a lot of interesting things. "Guy buys 63 acres of that Miller Road mess," Dennis said, wrapping both hands around a coffee mug. "Single dad, construction worker, no farming background. Just bought it. Cash savings and a loan." Ray shook his head. "That land hasn't produced anything in 8 years." "I know." "What's he planning to do with it?" Dennis shrugged. "He said he's going to farm it." Ray let out a short laugh. Not mean, just the laugh of a man who's seen this before. "Well," he said, "good luck to him." The story moved through Harlow the way stories do, from Dennis to Ray, from Ray to his wife, from his wife to her sister, who taught 3rd grade at Harlow Elementary, where Evan Thornton happened to be in class. From there, it spread the way small-town stories always spread, outward and slightly distorted, picking up details that weren't there and losing ones that were. By the time it reached most people's ears, Caleb Thornton was already becoming a kind of local punchline. Not a cruel one, just the kind that people share with a fond, pitying shake of the head. Poor guy. Lost his wife. Lost his mind a little. Bought that worthless piece of land out on Miller Road. Bless his heart. Okay. The auction where everything changed happened on a Saturday in October. Caleb had been on the farm for 3 weeks by then. He was sleeping in the farmhouse, barely habitable, but habitable, while working on clearing the fields in the daylight hours and repairing the interior at night. Evan was staying with Ruth through the school week and coming out on weekends, which Caleb hated, but accepted because the house was not yet safe or comfortable enough for a child full-time. He'd been thinking about equipment. You cannot farm 63 acres with hand tools and good intentions. You need machinery. And machinery, even used machinery, cost money he did not have in any sufficient quantity. He saw the auction listing on a county agricultural board website. An estate liquidation, a farm outside Hensley, 30 miles west, selling off equipment. Most of it was listed as non-operational. He read that and thought about it. Non-operational wasn't the same as unsalvageable. He drove out to Hensley on a Friday to preview the equipment. What he found were 6 tractors, various ages and makes, arranged in a row behind the barn. They were in bad shape. Rust had gotten into every crevice. Tires were flat and cracked. One had a caved-in cab. Another was missing its entire front axle assembly. A man standing next to him, older, ball cap, chew in his cheek, looked at the row of machines and spit into the dirt. "Scrap," the man said. "Every one of them." Caleb walked the line slowly, crouched by each one, looked underneath, checked for frame damage, rust penetration, the condition of the block where he could see it. 2 of them were genuinely too far gone, but 4, maybe all 6, he thought, if the engines were sound, had good bones. He stayed at the auction the next day. He sat in a folding chair and watched the bidding on other lots and did math in his head, running numbers he'd been running for weeks. When the 6 tractors came up as a single lot, sold together as is, no guarantee of anything, most of the room lost interest. The bidding opened at $800. It climbed slowly. At $2,200, there were 3 people left bidding. At $3,000, 2. At $4,000, one other man, a scrap dealer from out of county, and Caleb. The scrap dealer went to 4,200. Caleb sat with it for 3 seconds. He thought about his bank account. He thought about what he was doing. He raised his paddle. 4,800. The scrap dealer shook his head and sat back. The auctioneer called it. Caleb owned 6 broken tractors. Bam! Getting them to the farm required renting a flatbed trailer, 2 trips, and borrowing Ray Buckley's truck because his own truck's hitch wasn't rated for the weight. Ray let him borrow it without commentary, but Caleb saw the look on the man's face when he explained what the load was. That look said, "I hope you know what you're doing." Caleb wasn't entirely sure that he did. The tractors were lined up in the field beside the main barn by Sunday evening. Caleb stood looking at them in the fading light, hands in his pockets, and had a very clear moment of wondering if the man at the auction had been right. If they were all scrap. If he'd just spent nearly $5,000, a significant percentage of his remaining liquid savings, on 6 piles of rust. Behind him, he heard the crunch of gravel. A moment later, Evan appeared at his side, still in his backpack from the weekend trip from Ruth's. The boy looked at the tractors. He was quiet for a long time. "Those are really broken," Evan said finally. "Yeah. Like really, really broken." "Yeah." Evan thought about this. "Can you fix them?" "I don't know yet." The boy looked up at him. "But you think so?" Caleb studied the machines, the rust, the flat tires, the seized components, the work that was ahead of him. "I think some of them," he said. "Maybe all of them, if I'm lucky and I work hard enough." Evan nodded. He slid his small hand into Caleb's. "Okay," he said. "I'll help." Caleb looked down at his son. 8 years old, Marie's eyes. Marie's stubborn set to his jaw. "You will," Caleb said. "I know you will." They stood there a minute longer, the two of them, father and son, looking at 6 broken machines in a dead field as the October sky went dark around them. It wasn't a beginning that looked like a beginning. It looked like a mess. But it was the realest Caleb had felt in 2 years, and he was holding on to that the way a man holds on to something in a current, not gracefully, not confidently, just hard, with both hands, because letting go is not an option he is willing to consider. The town of Harlow found out about the tractors within a week. Small towns have a way of metabolizing information like a living organism, absorbing it, processing it, redistributing it in a slightly altered form. By the time the story of Caleb Thornton's 6 rusted tractors had made 2 full loops around Harlow's social geography, certain details had solidified into mythology. He spent his life savings on scrap metal. He's living out on that dead land in a house with no heat. The kid is out there with him on weekends, running around in a field full of rust. Some people were sympathetic. Most were skeptical. A few were quietly, privately entertained. Gary Meeks, who ran the feed store on County Line Road, told his Tuesday morning coffee group, "I drove by Miller Road the other day and I could see those tractors from the road, all lined up. I thought it was a junkyard at first." Laughter around the table. "What's he going to do with them?" someone asked. "Fix them, supposedly," Gary said. More laughter. More head shaking. "He's a construction worker," someone else said. "Not a mechanic, not a farmer." "I know. That land hasn't grown anything useful since the Kellermans had it, and they had equipment that actually worked." Gary sipped his coffee. "I know," he said. "I'm just telling you what I heard." The general consensus of Harlow, by November of that year, was that Caleb Thornton was a decent, well-meaning man going through a very hard time who had made a series of very poor decisions. And it was only a matter of time before reality reasserted itself, and he'd have to sell the land and move back into town and go back to construction, hopefully having learned something in the process. Nobody said this to his face. They didn't need to. He could feel it anyway. What no one in Harlow knew, what Caleb didn't know either, was that his name had been mentioned in a place very far from Harlow County. Victoria Sterling had a habit that her assistant, Dana, considered slightly eccentric. She read local news. Not the big outlets, not the national feeds she consumed every morning on her phone with her first cup of coffee. She meant the local stuff, the small county agricultural bulletins, the rural economic development newsletters, the kinds of publications that tracked land transactions commodity prices and tertiary markets, and the occasional human interest story that nobody else bothered to cover. She developed this habit during the early years of her career when she was trying to understand rural economies and agricultural investment at a granular level that the major outlets couldn't give her. She'd kept it up because she found it genuinely interesting, and because, as she told Dana once, the best deals she'd ever made came from watching things that no one else was paying attention to. She was 30 years old and ran Sterling Venture Group, which she'd built from a mid-sized inheritance her father left when she was 24 and a near-pathological appetite for work. She was also, by any reasonable measure, one of the sharper agricultural investors in the country, though she didn't particularly advertise this. She came across Caleb Thornton's name in a Harlow County agricultural bulletin. A land transaction notice, the standard kind, 8 lines of text. A Miller Road property, 63 acres, sold. New owner, Caleb Thornton. She almost scrolled past it. She almost always scrolled past things. That was the nature of the habit. You read a lot, and most of it was background noise, and then occasionally something caught the edge of your attention, and you went back and read it again. She went back and read it again. 63 acres on Miller Road. She pulled up the county map. The location was interesting. Better drainage than most of the surrounding properties. Southern exposure. The price was low. Very low, relative to the land's potential if worked properly. She searched the name. Not much came up. A LinkedIn profile for a construction company employee. A few tagged photos in what looked like a small-town setting. She'd learned to file names rather than act on them immediately. She added Caleb Thornton to a mental folder she kept for things worth watching. Then she went back to the 3 meetings she had before noon. She didn't think about him again for several weeks, but she didn't forget him either. That was the thing about Victoria Sterling. She very rarely forgot anything that had caught her attention once. December arrived and brought cold that had teeth. Caleb was working on the first tractor, a mid-70s John Deere that was the least damaged of the 6, in the barn with a space heater that worked about 60% of the time. He'd spent 4 weeks stripping it down, cataloging every component, ordering parts from 3 different suppliers, watching YouTube tutorials until midnight, and then going back out to the barn to apply what he'd watched. He'd never rebuilt an engine before. This was something he chose not to advertise. The first time he got the tractor to turn over, not run, just turn over, just crank, it was a Thursday night in December, close to 11 p.m., Evan asleep in the farmhouse. Caleb was alone in the barn, cold despite the heater, grease on his hands and forearms, and the engine turned over with a heavy, reluctant groan and then died. He sat back on his heels. His hands were shaking slightly, but not from cold. He'd done it, not finished it, not running, but turning over, which meant the block was sound, which meant it could be saved. He sat in the barn for a few minutes by himself, not celebrating, just letting it settle. Then he went inside, washed his hands, sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee, and made a list of what needed to happen next. He was not a man who celebrated small victories by celebrating. He celebrated them by going back to work. By the time winter broke, Caleb had 1 tractor running, 1 out of 6, after 4 months of work. 1. He drove it across the field on a March morning, Evan sitting on his lap grinning like it was Christmas, and the machine complained and shuddered and threw smoke and was nowhere near reliable. But it moved, it pulled. It was, in some essential sense, alive. He still had 5 broken tractors and 63 acres of unworked land and a farmhouse that still needed significant work and a bank account that kept him awake some nights. But he had 1 tractor, and he had his son on his lap. And somewhere in Harlow, people were still talking about the man on Miller Road who'd bought scrap metal and dead land and was, against all reasonable probability, still out there, still trying, still refusing to admit what everyone else could plainly see. That was the thing about Caleb Thornton that people in town couldn't quite decide how to feel about. He just kept going, even when he shouldn't have, even when the numbers didn't work and the machines didn't cooperate and the land resisted and the cold went into his bones. He just kept going. And somewhere across the country, a woman he had never met was still watching, still paying attention, still waiting to see what a man like that would do next. The second tractor took 6 weeks. Not because Caleb got faster, he didn't, not exactly, but because the first one had taught him things that no YouTube video could. He'd learned how his hands worked against a seized bolt. He'd learned the particular sound an engine makes when it's close, but not there yet. That low, reluctant groan that means keep going, don't stop now. He'd learned to read parts diagrams the way a man learns to read a map of a place he's never been. Slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, then with the strange satisfaction of someone who no longer needs the map at all. The second tractor was an older Massey Ferguson with a cracked block that everyone who looked at it said was finished. The crack ran 4 inches along the left side, thin as a fingernail scratch. 2 different mechanics Caleb had asked, casually, at the parts counter, not wanting to reveal too much, had both shaken their heads. "Block's cracked. You're done," the first one said. "Unless you weld it," the second one said. "And even then, I wouldn't bet on it holding under load." Caleb learned to weld. He bought a used MIG welder from a man selling tools out of his garage in Delwood, watched 40 hours of welding tutorials over 2 weeks, burned through a lot of scrap metal practicing, and then, on a Saturday in April with Evan sitting on a hay bale, watching from behind a welding mask 2 sizes too big for his face, he ran a bead along that crack that wasn't pretty but was solid. "Is it going to work?" Evan asked from behind the mask, his voice slightly muffled. "We'll find out," Caleb said. It worked. Not perfectly. The first time he ran the engine under load, it leaked a small amount of fluid from the weld seam and he had to go back and run another pass. But the second pass held. And when he finally drove that Massey Ferguson out of the barn in late April and put it to the soil for the first time, it pulled without complaint, and the crack held. And Caleb sat up on that seat in the thin spring sunlight, feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to, I can do this. 2 tractors, 4 to go. Spring moved into summer, and the farm began to show its first real signs of life, though not in any way that Harlow County would have found impressive. The cleared sections of field had been turned and amended with compost Caleb had spent the winter building from the brush he'd cleared. He'd put in a test crop, 40 acres of winter wheat and a section of soybeans, using seed he'd bought on credit from Gary Meeks at the feed store. Gary hadn't said anything discouraging when Caleb came in to order. He just processed the order with a neutral expression and said the seed would be ready Thursday. That neutrality was its own kind of kindness, and Caleb recognized it as such. The wheat came up in late April, thin at first, then thicker as the weeks passed, until one morning Caleb stood at the edge of the field and looked at 40 acres of young green wheat, moving in a light wind, and had to put his hands in his pockets and look at his boots for a moment, because the sight of it was unexpectedly overwhelming. He'd grown something. He'd put dead land and seed and water and work together and produced something alive and real that hadn't been there before. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to the barn and got to work on tractor number 3. The phone call from Ruth came on a Wednesday evening in June. Caleb was under the 3rd tractor, a 2-wheel drive Ford that had a hydraulic problem he'd been diagnosing for a week, when his phone buzzed in his shirt pocket. He rolled out from under the machine, checked the screen, and answered. "Hey, Ruth." "Caleb?" Her voice was careful, the same careful it had been on the phone the night he'd told her about buying the farm. "I need to talk to you about something." He sat up on the barn floor, back against the tractor's rear tire. "What's going on?" "I had coffee with Linda Meeks this morning, Gary's wife." "Okay." "She told me people have been talking about you, about the farm." A pause. "Not kindly." Caleb said nothing. "She said some people think that you're not handling everything well, since Marie, and that the farm is—" Ruth stopped, started again. "People are saying you've put Evan in an unstable situation, living out there, the condition of the house, the money you've spent." Caleb looked up at the barn rafters. Swallows had built a nest up there sometime in March. He could hear the chicks. "Who's saying that?" he asked. His voice was flat, not angry, just flat. "It doesn't matter who specifically." "Ruth," he said it gently but firmly. "Who's saying it?" She sighed. "A few people. I don't think they mean harm. I think some of them genuinely worry about you. And Evan. Evan's fine. I know he is. I see him every week. I know he's fine. He's happy, Caleb. He talks about the farm constantly. He talks about the tractors and the wheat and... Her voice caught slightly. He sounds like you, actually. The way you used to sound when you were excited about something. Caleb didn't say anything to that. I'm not calling to tell you to stop, Ruth said. I wanted you to know what's being said, so it doesn't blindside you. Okay, Caleb said. I appreciate that. Are you all right? He thought about the 40 acres of wheat out there in the dark. He thought about the 2 tractors he'd put back on their feet with his own hands. He thought about Evan in his hay bale seat with his oversized welding mask. Yeah, he said. I'm all right. After he hung up, he sat on the barn floor for a few minutes, doing nothing. Not thinking about the wheat or the tractors or the money. Just sitting. Letting the weight of what Ruth had told him settle onto him, because that was the only honest way to carry something. Feel the actual weight of it first, then figure out how to move. People thought he was broken. People thought he was failing his son. That one went deep. He couldn't pretend it didn't. He pressed the back of his head against the tractor tire and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then he rolled back under the machine. He had a hydraulic line to find. Evan turned 9 that summer, and Caleb threw him a birthday party at the farm that was, by any objective standard, a pretty rough affair. Caleb had strung lights between the 2 functioning tractors and set up picnic tables he'd borrowed from the community center in Harlow. Ruth brought a cake. 3 of Evan's classmates came, along with their parents, who stood around in small groups looking at the partially cleared fields and the row of half-repaired machinery with expressions that ranged from politely impressed to openly puzzled. One of the fathers, a man named Brett Calloway, who worked in insurance and had the permanent air of a man who had priced every risk and found them excessive, caught Caleb by the barn while the kids were chasing each other through the field. So you're really doing this, Brett said. He wasn't unfriendly, just he had that tone, the tone that meant he'd already decided. Yeah, Caleb said. Agriculture. In this county. That's the idea. Brett nodded slowly. My brother-in-law farmed, over in Crestview County, 8 years, then he lost the operation. Market prices, equipment costs. He shook his head. It's a tough business. I know, Caleb said. You have a background in it? No? Brett blinked. Then, I'm learning, Caleb said simply. Brett looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has run the numbers in his head and doesn't like the result. Well, he said finally, good luck to you. He said it the way people say good luck when they mean the opposite. Caleb smiled at him. Thanks, Brett. He went back to the party. Evan was trying to teach one of his classmates how to climb on the non-running tractor that sat closest to the barn, the one with the caved-in cab that Caleb hadn't touched yet. The kid was laughing. Evan was giving directions with the serious authority of someone who had spent considerable time on farm equipment. Caleb watched his son for a moment. Ruth appeared at his side with a cup of lemonade. She handed it to him without ceremony. He's in his element, she said quietly. Yeah. He told me he helps you at night, working on the machines. He hands me tools, Caleb said. He's good at remembering where things go. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Caleb, I owe you an apology. He looked at her. For what? For the call last month. I shouldn't have. I was worried, and I passed that worry along to you in a way that wasn't helpful. She looked at Evan in the field. You're doing something real here. I can see it. I'm sorry I let other people's noise get in my ears. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You were looking out for Evan, he said. That's your job. That's all it was. She patted his arm once, the way she used to when he was newer to the family and still finding his footing with her, and then went to refill the lemonade pitcher. Caleb looked out at the farm, the working fields, the repaired fence line, the 2 tractors that ran, the 4 that didn't yet. One step, one piece, one day. That was all it was. He drank his lemonade. The 3rd tractor, the Ford with the hydraulic problem, turned out to have a cracked hydraulic pump housing that had been repaired badly at some point in its past, the repair failing slowly over years until the whole system was unreliable. Caleb found this after 2 weeks of diagnosis that had included 4 wrong guesses and one night where he nearly gave up on that particular machine entirely. He'd been lying under it at 11:30 at night, flashlight in his teeth, running his fingers along the hydraulic lines for the fourth time when he found it. A hairline fracture in the housing, hidden under a layer of old paint and accumulated grease. He almost missed it. He lay there for a moment with his fingers on the fracture. "There you are," he said to no one. He ordered the part the next morning. It arrived in 4 days. He installed it on a Sunday afternoon while Evan sat nearby doing homework, or ostensibly doing homework. Mostly Evan was watching him work and asking questions. "Why does hydraulic fluid feel slippery like that?" "Because it's oil-based. Same reason cooking oil feels slippery." "Why do the lines have to be that specific size?" "Pressure. If the line's too small, the pressure builds up too fast and something fails. Too big and you lose pressure. It has to be right." Evan absorbed this. "How do you know all this stuff now?" Caleb tightened a fitting. "I read a lot of manuals, and I made a lot of mistakes." "Mrs. Patterson says mistakes are how you learn." "Mrs. Patterson's right. She also says you should try to learn from other people's mistakes instead of your own." "That's also right. Harder to do in practice, though." Evan considered this. "Which is better?" Caleb sat up and looked at his son. "The mistakes you make yourself stick better," he said, "even if they cost more." Evan nodded like he was filing this away for later. Then he went back to his homework. 3 tractors running by August. Victoria Sterling came across Caleb Thornton's name again in early September, 11 months after she'd first noticed it. She was reviewing a quarterly agricultural investment report from a research firm she used, one that tracked land productivity trends in secondary and tertiary agricultural counties. In a section on Harlow County, there was a brief notation: increased activity on a previously dormant Miller Road property, preliminary data suggesting soil preparation and a first-season crop. She pulled up the county agricultural records. The notation was accurate. Someone had been working that land actively. The test crop acreage was modest but represented a serious investment of labor. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her office, which was in a high-rise in the financial district and had a view of the city that most people would have been distracted by, and she no longer noticed at all. Caleb Thornton, single dad, construction worker, 63 acres. She pulled up the brief notes she'd kept on him 11 months ago, added the new information. Then she opened a separate window and started looking more carefully. What she found over the next 2 hours was a pattern that she recognized because she'd seen it before. Not often, but enough to know what it meant. A person operating with extremely limited resources, making a series of decisions that looked irrational from the outside but reflected a clear internal logic. The land purchase at the low point of the property's market value. The tractor auction. She found the estate sale records, saw the price he'd paid for the lot, and almost smiled. Smart, genuinely smart. Everyone in that room saw scrap. Someone had seen salvage. The question was whether he could execute. She flagged the file. She told Dana to add Harlow County to her quarterly review list. "Specifically?" Dana asked. "Specifically, the Miller Road property, and anything associated with a Caleb Thornton." Dana wrote it down. "Should I reach out?" "No," Victoria said. "Not yet. We watch." Baton. October came and brought the wheat harvest, which was Caleb's first, and which went sideways in 3 distinct ways before it was over. The first problem was the harvester. He didn't own one. He'd rented time on a neighbor's combine through an informal arrangement, and the neighbor's machine broke down on day 2, leaving 12 acres of mature wheat standing in the field while Caleb scrambled to find an alternative. He spent a day and a half on the phone, calling every contact he'd made in 11 months of farming, before locating a custom harvesting crew 2 counties over who had a gap in their schedule and could come the following Monday. He lost some grain in the wait, not catastrophically, but not nothing. The second problem was moisture content. The delay meant the wheat stood in the field longer than ideal, and when the crew finally came and ran it, the moisture readings were higher than the grain elevator preferred. He had to negotiate a price adjustment that cut into his margin. The third problem was that 2 of his 3 running tractors decided, seemingly in solidarity, to develop problems during harvest week. The John Deere threw a belt on Tuesday. The Massey Ferguson started leaking from the weld seam again, not badly, but enough to require monitoring. He fixed the belt himself in 2 hours. He monitored the weld leak and dealt with it after harvest. When it was over, he sat down at the kitchen table with his farm ledger and added up the numbers with a pencil because he'd been keeping records by hand since the start. Old habit from construction. Paper doesn't crash. Paper doesn't require a password. The first harvest had turned a small profit. Not a large one. Not the kind that justified telling anyone about. But positive. The column on the right side of the ledger was larger than the column on the left. He looked at that for a while. Then he went to Evan's room where the boy was doing homework and knocked on the open door. "Hey," he said. "First harvest came in." Evan looked up. "Did we make money?" "A little." Evan grinned. That big, unguarded grin that was pure Evan, not Marie, just Evan. "How much?" "Enough," Caleb said. "Can we get a dog?" Caleb laughed. It came out sounding a little rusty, the way it always did now, but real. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I've been wanting a dog for 2 years. I know you have." "A farm needs a dog, Dad. That's just a fact." "Where did you get that from?" "Everywhere," Evan said with complete confidence. "It's a known thing." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "Get your homework done," he said. "We'll talk about a dog." "That means no." "That means get your homework done." Evan turned back to his books with the exaggerated suffering of a 9-year-old being denied something he considers fundamental. Caleb went back to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down with his ledger. Small profit. 5 tractors either running or fixable. 1 season in the ground and done. He wasn't where he needed to be. Not close. But he was moving in a direction, and the direction was forward, and tonight that was enough. He fell asleep at the kitchen table at some point after 10, ledger open in front of him, pencil still in his hand. The 4th tractor was the hardest. It was a late-model Case IH that looked like it had been through something traumatic. The cab was partially caved on the left side. The engine had seized completely, and when Caleb finally got the engine apart, he found damage that suggested someone had run it without oil long enough for the bearings to destroy themselves. 2 connecting rods were bent. The crankshaft had scoring that made Caleb's stomach drop the first time he measured it. 3 different people he showed photos to told him to scrap it. He didn't scrap it. What the Case had that the others didn't was a power output rating significantly higher than anything else in his fleet. If he could fix it, it would transform what he could do with the larger fields in year 2. He'd run the numbers enough times that he knew this. The Case was worth fixing if it could be fixed. He spent 8 weeks on it through the fall and winter. He had the crankshaft machined at a shop in Delwood. A cost that made him wince, but that was cheaper than a replacement. He sourced rebuilt connecting rods from a salvage operation in Ohio. He rebuilt the head himself. He left the cab damage alone for now because the cab didn't make it run, and running was what mattered. January, February, cold that came in through the walls of the barn no matter how he arranged the space heater. Evan came out on weekends and sat in the barn with him, sometimes helping, sometimes doing homework on a workbench, sometimes just sitting nearby in a way that Caleb found quietly sustaining. The boy never asked when it would be done. He just showed up, the same way Caleb showed up, without needing it to be finished yet. That was the thing about Evan that Caleb hadn't been prepared for. He'd expected to be the one holding his son up through all of this. He hadn't expected the reverse to also be true. On a Wednesday night in late February, Caleb got the Case to start. Not just turn over, start, run. Rough and unhappy at first, but settling into something real as the oil pressure came up and the temperature stabilized. He stood in the barn alone. Evan was at Ruth's, it was a school night, and listened to that engine run, and the sound of it was one of the better sounds he'd heard in a long time. He didn't call anyone. He just stood there for a while and let it be real. 4 tractors. Running. 2 still to go. By the time winter gave way to the second spring, Victoria Sterling had built a file on Caleb Thornton that was considerably thicker than a monitoring note. She had the land records, the crop data she could piece together from county agricultural reports, the equipment auction history. She'd had a research associate drive through Harlow County in January, not to stop, just to look, and come back with photographs of the Miller Road property taken from the road. She'd looked at those photographs for a long time. The farm didn't look like success. Not yet. It looked like a man deep in the middle of something very difficult that he refused to stop doing. The fields that had been worked were visible, even in winter. The cleared fence lines, the prepared ground, the organized layout of the operation. The row of tractors by the barn, 5 of them visible in the photos. One of them new to the row since her research associate's previous drive-through. One more fixed. She showed the photos to her senior investment analyst, a man named Paul Garrett, who had been with Sterling Venture Group for 4 years and who she trusted more than almost anyone on her team. "What am I looking at?" Paul asked. "A farm," she said. "Harlow County, 2nd year of operation." Paul studied the photos. "Who's the operator?" "Self-financed, single operator, started with nothing and bought distressed equipment and distressed land." Paul looked at her. "How distressed?" "The equipment was lot sold as scrap. The land hadn't produced anything in 8 years." He looked at the photos again, then at her. "And?" "He's producing," Victoria said simply. Year 1, he ran a profitable crop on a fraction of the field's potential acreage. "He's been systematically restoring the equipment. I can track it from auction records and repair supply purchases." She paused. "He's doing it right. Slowly but right." "Who is he?" "Construction worker, 32, widower, raising a kid." Paul was quiet for a moment. "That's a story," he said. "That's a farm," Victoria said. "The story is incidental." But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd been watching Caleb Thornton for over a year. She knew the facts of his operation with the precision she brought to every investment she considered. But there was something else there, something she was honest with herself about in the private way she was honest about things she didn't say out loud. She was moved by it. Not sentimentally, not in a way that would cloud her judgment, but the stubbornness of it, the sheer refusal to accept what everyone around him had concluded, the man in the barn at midnight learning to weld because he needed to weld. That meant something to her. She'd built her own career on a version of the same stubborn conviction that the thing everyone said was impossible was only impossible if you agreed with them. She closed the file. "Keep tracking it," she said. "I want to know how year 2 goes." Year 2 was harder than year 1 in ways Caleb hadn't anticipated, and easier in ways he also hadn't expected. The harder part was scale. He'd put significantly more acreage into production, using the restored case and the running John Deere and Massey Ferguson to work ground that had sat unworked through year 1. More acreage meant more inputs, more management, more things that could and did go wrong. He had a disease pressure problem in May that hit 30 acres of his soybean crop before he identified it and responded. He lost yield he couldn't afford to lose. He also had an equipment failure in June that cost him 3 weeks of prime growing season on the North Field. The Ford, the one with the hydraulic repair, developed a secondary issue he hadn't caught, and by the time he diagnosed and fixed it, the planting window for that section was compromised. He sat in the truck one evening after a day like that and hit the steering wheel once, hard, with the heel of his hand. Just once. Then he started the truck and drove home. The easier part, the unexpected part, was other people. Gary Meeks at the feed store had stopped giving him the neutral face by spring. Gary had started giving him the honest face, which was different. He'd say things like, "I heard you had trouble with disease in the South Field. You try copper-based fungicide early in the rotation next year." Or, "The Davenport operation over in Shelby County does something interesting with their drainage. Might be worth a call." Not everyone in Harlow had come around. Plenty of people still thought Caleb Thornton was running a long, slow experiment in how to lose everything gracefully. But some had shifted. Not to belief, exactly. More to cautious, qualified interest. And then there was Dale Hutchins. Dale was 71 years old and had farmed Harlow County for 40 of those years before his knees forced him to a modified operation. He drove out to Miller Road unannounced on a Tuesday in July, knocked on the farmhouse door, and when Caleb answered, said, "I hear you've got that Massey Ferguson running." Caleb looked at him. "Yeah. I had one of those for 20 years, Dale said. You have trouble with the hydraulic remote on it? Not yet. You will. That's a design issue on that generation. I can show you a modification that prevents it. Caleb stepped back from the door. You want to come in? Dale looked at him with the weathered directness of a man who had never quite seen the point of being indirect. I want to see the machine, he said. So Caleb showed him the machine. Dale walked around the Massey Ferguson with the slow, assessive movements of someone who has the right to take his time. He crouched, with some difficulty, and looked underneath. He ran a hand over the hydraulic lines. He looked at Caleb's weld repair on the block and was quiet for a moment. Did you do that yourself? He said. Yeah. Dale stood up. How long ago did you learn to weld? About a year. Dale looked at the weld again. That's not bad, he said, in a way that communicated it was actually quite good, and he was not the kind of man who said quite good. You did it twice? Second pass to fix the leak. Dale nodded. The modification on the hydraulic remote takes about an hour, if you've got the parts. What parts? Dale told him. Caleb had most of them. He ordered the rest that afternoon. Dale came back the following Saturday, and they did the modification together, the old farmer talking him through it, Caleb's hands doing the work. They didn't talk much beyond the task. Caleb made coffee at some point, and they drank it in the barn, sitting on upturned crates, and Dale looked at the row of tractors. You've got two still not running, he said. Working on it. The one on the end, is that a Case IH? Yeah, I got the engine running in February. What's left? Electrical system. The wiring harness is shot. Dale made a sound of recognition. That generation had issues with the wiring. He drank his coffee. I know someone who specializes in case electrical. He's in Hensley. Old guy, semi-retired. He'll come out if you ask him right. Caleb looked at him. Why are you helping me? Dale considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which Caleb appreciated. Because you're doing something real, the old man said. And real things deserve to not fail for stupid reasons. He paused. Also because everyone in this county has been talking about you for a year and a half, and I wanted to see if you were actually as dumb as they said, or if there was something to it. Which is it? Dale looked around the barn, at the organized tool wall, at the logbook Caleb kept on a shelf by the door, at the repaired machinery. There's something to it, he said. He finished his coffee, stood up with the effort of a man whose joints had strong opinions about mornings, and picked up his hat. I'll tell Morris about you, he said. The Case electrical guy. Expect a call. He left without ceremony, the way he'd arrived. Caleb sat in the barn for a moment after he heard Dale's truck leave. Then he wrote Morris's name in his logbook, so he wouldn't forget it. One problem solved, one more connection made. That was how year 2 went, harder in the big ways and shot through with small, unexpected moments of help from people who didn't say they were helping. They just showed up and showed him something. He was still short on money, still working longer hours than was sustainable, still coming in from the barn at 1 a.m. with hands that ached and a mind that wouldn't quiet down for another hour. But the farm was real now in a way it hadn't been a year ago. The soil was building. The equipment was gaining ground. The fields were producing. And Evan, who was 9 going on 40, had appointed himself the unofficial record keeper of the operation, maintaining a notebook of his own, copied from his father's logbook, where he tracked which tractor was running, what each field was planted with, and, in a section he'd titled Problems Fixed, a running list of every mechanical issue they'd solved. Caleb found this notebook one evening on the kitchen table and stood there reading it for a while. The handwriting was still a kid's handwriting, uneven and earnest, but the information was accurate, every detail right. He put the notebook back exactly where he had found it. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. He thought about Marie and what she would think of her son keeping a farm logbook at 9 years old. He decided she would have found it very funny and also would have been deeply, quietly proud. He went back to the barn. Tractor number 5 was waiting. Morris Caldwell showed up on a Thursday morning in August, driving a truck that was older than most of the tractors on Caleb's property and carrying a toolbox that looked like it had survived 2 wars and a flood. He was 68, small, with hands that seemed disproportionately large for the rest of him, and a way of looking at electrical problems that reminded Caleb of the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not at the surface, but through it, at what's underneath. He walked straight to the Case IH without introduction, crouched beside it, and started pulling panels. Dale said you got the engine running, Morris said, not looking up. February, Caleb said. What did you do to the wiring harness? Nothing yet? That's why you're here. Morris grunted. He pulled a section of harness free and held it up to the light, turning it slowly. The insulation was cracked in 3 places Caleb could see from where he stood, and Morris was finding more as he traced the line with his thumb. This harness didn't just fail, Morris said. Someone repaired it at some point, badly. He showed Caleb a section where 2 wires had been spliced with electrical tape that had long since dried and cracked. See that? Someone did this in the field, emergency repair, and then never came back to fix it properly. And then it sat for however many years until the tape gave up completely. Can you fix it? Morris put the harness down and looked at Caleb for the first time directly. He had pale gray eyes that were direct without being unkind. I can fix anything electrical, he said. It wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact, delivered the same way you'd say the sky is blue. Question is what it costs and whether that makes sense for you. Give me a number, Caleb said. Morris turned back to the machine and kept pulling panels, taking his time, thorough in a way that made Caleb trust him immediately, because it was the same thoroughness he tried to bring to his own work. He spent 20 minutes going through every accessible section of the wiring system, making small sounds to himself, occasionally writing something in a notebook he produced from his back pocket. When he was done, he stood up and looked at his notes. Full harness replacement is the right call, he said. I can source the harness. There's a supplier I use in Tennessee. Good quality, correct spec. Labor. I'll need 2 days out here. He named a number. It was less than Caleb had feared and more than he had easily available. I'll make it work, Caleb said. I'll call the supplier today, Morris said. Parts in about 10 days. I'll come back then. He started putting his tools away with the same methodical efficiency he'd unpacked them. Morris, Caleb said. The old man looked up. Dale said you're semi-retired. I appreciate you coming out. Morris considered this for a moment, as though appreciation was a currency he wasn't sure of the exchange rate for. Dale's a good man, he said finally. He told me what you were doing out here. I wanted to see it. He closed his toolbox. The case is a good machine. Shouldn't have been left to rot. He drove out the same way he came in, without fanfare, without small talk, in a truck that sounded like it was performing the mechanical equivalent of a man walking through pain. Caleb watched him go and then turned back to the barn. 10 days. He had 10 days before the wiring harness arrived, and a field to prepare in the meantime. He went to get the John Deere. Chant. The 5th tractor came online in September, 6 weeks after Morris's first visit and 3 days after his second. Morris had worked on the Case IH with a focus so complete that Caleb had learned simply to stay out of his way and hand him things when asked. The old electrician didn't explain himself as he worked the way some people do. He wasn't teaching, he wasn't performing. He was just working, deeply and precisely, and the work was explanation enough if you paid attention. When he was finished, he had Caleb sit in the cab and start the machine. Everything came on. Every light, every gauge, every system. The Case IH, cab still dented, cosmetics still rough, hummed with a functional authority it had not possessed since before Caleb bought it. He sat in the cab for a moment. Then he climbed down and paid Morris in cash, because Morris preferred cash, and Caleb had set the money aside for this specifically. Morris counted it without embarrassment, pocketed it, and picked up his toolbox. That's a good machine now, he said. Thanks to you, Caleb said. Morris shook his head once, a small, definitive motion. I fixed the wiring. You fixed everything else. He paused at his truck door. What's the last one? Caleb looked down the row. At the end, the 6th tractor, an international harvester from the early 80s, sat where it had always sat, untouched. He'd been systematically avoiding it because he knew what it needed and didn't yet know how to give it that. Engine rebuild, Caleb said. Full one. The block is cracked in 2 places, cylinders are scored, it needs sleeves. Morris studied him. That's a machine shop job. I know, I've been pricing it. And? It's the most expensive thing I've done yet. Morris was quiet for a moment. The case you just started, he said, has a higher power output than that IH. Do you need the IH to run? It was a fair question, a practical question. Caleb had asked it himself. I need 6 tractors, he said. Not because I strictly need the horsepower right now, because I said I'd fix them. Morris looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes. All right, he said, and then, unexpectedly, there's a machine shop in Crestview. Man named Holt runs it. Tell him Morris Caldwell sent you. He'll give you a fair price. He got in his truck. Caleb stood in the farm lane and watched him go, the same way he'd watched him arrive, and thought about the strange network that had been forming around him over the past year. Dale and Morris and Gary Meeks, and his arrangement with the custom harvesting crew and the parts supplier in Ohio. People he hadn't known 18 months ago who now formed a kind of loose, unofficial infrastructure around what he was trying to do. Nobody had put a sign up. Nobody had made a committee. They just showed up. He didn't take it for granted. He never took anything for granted anymore. Year two's harvest came in October and was better than year one in every measurable way. It was not a great harvest. He lost yield in the north field where the Ford's breakdown in June had compressed his planting window, and the soybean disease pressure he'd fought in May had left its mark despite his response. But the wheat on the main fields performed well, and the additional acreage he'd brought into production made the total numbers significantly better than the previous year. He sat with the ledger on a Sunday night, pencil in hand, and ran the numbers twice because he didn't trust them the first time. The operation was profitable, not just marginally this time, actually profitable, enough to cover his loan payment with room to spare, enough to start a small equipment maintenance fund that he'd been trying to build for a year, not enough to stop watching every dollar with the careful attention of a man who knew exactly how fast things could go bad. But real, undeniable. He went to the machine shop in Crestview on a Monday morning and talked to a man named Holt, who was maybe 60, wore a canvas apron, and whose shop smelled of metal and cutting oil in a way Caleb had come to find oddly comfortable. Holt looked at Caleb's photos of the IH, asked questions about the cylinder scoring and the crack locations, and quoted him a number for the full block rebuild. It was steep. I can do it in 2 stages, Holt said. We sleeve the cylinders first, get the blocks sealed. Second stage, we balance and finish. Breaks up the cost. How long between stages? Whenever you're ready for stage 2, no rush on my end. Caleb put his hands in his pockets and looked at Holt's quote written on a work order form. 2 stages. He could swing stage 1 now, and stage 2 in spring if the winter planning paid off. Do it, he said. Holt nodded and picked up his pen. Morris's boy, he said. Caleb looked at him. Sorry? Morris Caldwell. He called ahead, said you might come in. Holt filled in the work order. Morris doesn't recommend people he doesn't think well of. He didn't mention that. No, Holt said. He wouldn't. November arrived cold and early, and with it came something Caleb hadn't expected. His first formal inquiry from outside the county. It came as a letter, actual physical mail, which was unusual enough that he looked at the envelope for a moment before opening it. The letterhead read, Grayson Agricultural Consultancy, based in the state capital. The letter was brief and professional, informing him that Grayson Agricultural was conducting a survey of emerging agricultural operations in the region and that his property had been flagged as a site of interest. They were asking if he would be willing to participate in a site assessment visit. He read it twice. Then he set it on the kitchen table and stood there with his arms crossed, reading it a 3rd time. Evan came through the kitchen, grabbed an apple from the bowl, looked at the letter, and read it over Caleb's shoulder with the unselfconscious nosiness that was one of his defining qualities. What's a site assessment? Evan asked. They want to come look at the farm, professionally. Why? Apparently someone flagged us as interesting. Evan bit into his apple and thought about this. Are we interesting? Caleb looked at the letter. Apparently. Are you going to say yes? He was quiet for a moment. Part of him was suspicious of it, the part that had been operating on the margins for 2 years and had learned to be careful about things that arrived unexpectedly. But the letterhead was real. He'd looked up Grayson Agricultural, and they were a legitimate operation, and there was no obvious downside to letting people come and look at his fields. Yeah, he said. I think so. Cool, Evan said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. The site assessment happened in early December, conducted by a woman named Dr. Sarah Okafor, who had a PhD in soil science and a habit of crouching in fields and taking photographs of the ground that initially struck Caleb as odd, and then, after watching her work for an hour, struck him as completely reasonable. She spent most of a day on the property, walking the fields, taking core samples, reviewing his soil amendment records, asking questions that were specific enough to tell him she'd done her homework before she came. How did you determine your amendment ratios in year 1? She asked, crouched in the south field taking a core sample. Soil tests through the extension office, Caleb said. And reading. A lot of reading. What did you read? He named the books and extension bulletins. She knew most of them. Your pH management in year 1 was conservative, she said. But it was right. A lot of operators in your position overcorrect and create secondary problems. You didn't. I was scared to mess it up, he said honestly. She looked up at him. That's a legitimate soil management philosophy, she said, and he thought she was being dry, and then he looked at her expression and realized she wasn't. At the end of the day, she sat with him at the kitchen table and went through her preliminary findings. The soil health indicators were significantly improved from the baseline she'd been able to reconstruct from county records. The rotation choices he'd made in year 2 showed good instinct for long-term soil structure. The drainage patterns he'd worked with, rather than against, had prevented compaction problems that she'd seen sink operations twice the size of his. You've done something legitimate here, she said. Not expansively, just directly, as a statement of assessment. Thank you, Caleb said. I'd like to include the Miller Road operation in our regional study. With your permission, we'd come back in spring and run a more comprehensive assessment. What does that involve? She explained. It was non-intrusive. Observations, data collection, soil samples, conversations with him about methods. No contractual obligation on his part. The study would be published in an agricultural research journal. Sure, he said. After she left, he stood in the kitchen for a moment. An agricultural researcher wanted to study his farm. 2 years ago, this land had grown nothing but weeds, and the machinery that now sat mostly operational in a row by his barn had been sold as scrap. He didn't let himself feel too much about this. Feeling too much about things had a way of throwing your footing off when the ground shifted again, and the ground always shifted again eventually. But he let himself feel a little, just a little. Victoria Sterling received Grayson Agricultural's Regional Survey Preliminary Report in January, as she received every agricultural research document from that region that her research service flagged as relevant. The Miller Road property in Harlow County was not named specifically. The study used parcel identification numbers rather than addresses. But she had enough reference points to cross-reference the data, and when she did, she sat with the results for a long time. The soil health trajectory, the yield improvement between years 1 and 2, the input efficiency, the ratio of what went into the ground to what came out of it, which was, she noted with something between admiration and the cold satisfaction of having watched a thesis prove itself, genuinely remarkable for a second-year operation. She pulled up Caleb's file. It had grown considerably thicker over 2 years. The land acquisition, the tractor auction, the first crop, the second crop, the equipment timeline she'd reconstructed from public records and research. She'd built a picture of this farm as carefully as she built pictures of any investment she considered seriously. She looked at the preliminary soil data again. Then she called Paul Garrett into her office. He came in with his coffee and looked at the documents she spread on her desk. Harlow County, he said. The Miller Road property, year 2 numbers. Paul sat down. He read through the summary. He was quiet for a bit. The input efficiency is unusual, he said. Very. Is this operator doing something systematically different, or is this a soil type advantage? Combination, Victoria said. The land has good bones. I've thought that since I first looked at it. But the soil trajectory is management. That's not what you get from good bones alone. Paul set the document down. What are you thinking? Victoria leaned back in her chair. She had a way of pausing before saying the important thing that her team had learned meant she'd already decided something and was considering how to phrase it. "I want to go see it," she said. Paul looked at her. "In person." "Yes." "You want to drive out to Harlow County and look at a 63-acre farm. 63 acres currently in active production, with soil metrics that are outperforming properties 3 times the size and 5 times the capitalization." She paused. "And an operator who rebuilt 6 tractors from scrap with no prior mechanical training while managing a first and second year crop." Paul was quiet. "The scale is small," Victoria said. "The operation is small, but the system is sound, and the person running it is—" She stopped, chose a word. "Exceptional." "When do you want to go?" "Spring, after planting." She picked up the soil report. "I want to see what the fields look like when they're working." Caleb got a letter from Harlow County Bank in February. It was not the kind of letter you want to get in February. His operating loan, which he'd taken out to fund the land purchase and initial startup costs, had been reviewed in the bank's annual portfolio assessment. Due to evolving lending criteria and the agricultural risk classification of his loan type, the bank was requesting a meeting to discuss the terms. He called the number on the letter. The loan officer, a man named Doug Fenn, whom Caleb had spoken to exactly twice before, had the voice of someone delivering information he would rather not be delivering. "We're looking at the agricultural loan portfolio across the board," Doug said. "Your loan came up in the review. Your payment history has been good." "That's not the issue." "Then what's the issue?" Caleb asked. A pause. "The bank's risk assessment for small agricultural operations in your county has been revised. We're looking at potentially restructuring some of these loans. In some cases, that may mean a balloon payment at the 2-year mark rather than the original 7-year amortization." Caleb sat down at the kitchen table. "A balloon payment. It's not finalized. That's why we're scheduling meetings. We want to talk through options." "What's the balloon payment amount?" Doug told him. Caleb looked at his ledger. He looked at his year 2 numbers, which he'd been quietly proud of. He looked at the modest equipment fund he'd been building. The balloon payment was significantly larger than any of it. "When's the meeting?" he said. "3rd week of March." "I'll be there." He hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. This was the kind of problem that didn't have a clever solution. This wasn't a seized hydraulic line you could trace until you found the break. This was a financial institution with its own pressures and criteria, and he was one file in a stack of files. And a good payment history did not guarantee you'd still have a loan at the end of the conversation. He went to the barn, not to work, just to walk through it, to look at the 5 running tractors and the 6th one, which Holt in Crestview was rebuilding, which would be ready in spring, to look at the logbook on the shelf, to look at Evan's notebook, which the boy had started keeping out here since Caleb had seen it and said nothing, and which now had 2 full years of entries in that earnest, slightly uneven handwriting. He stood in the barn for a while. He'd built something real here. That was not a feeling or an impression. It was in the soil samples and the yield records and the fact that Dr. Okafor wanted to come back in spring with a full research team. It was real. The question was whether real was enough. He went back inside and called his accountant, a woman in Delwood named Paula, who did agricultural accounting for a dozen operations in the county, and who had agreed to help him for a reduced rate because she respected what he was trying to do, which she'd told him directly and without sentiment. "I got a letter from the bank," he said. "Balloon payment review," Paula said immediately. "I've seen 4 of these this month. They're doing it across their agricultural portfolio." "What are my options?" "Tell me exactly what they said." She listened while he read the letter to her. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and he could hear her thinking. "Okay, the good news is your payment history is clean, and your year 2 numbers give you something to work with. The bad news is that the amount they're talking about isn't something you can cover from operations." "I know. So we look at refinancing with another institution. I can make some calls this week. I also think you should go into that March meeting with your year 2 financials and the Grayson Agricultural Preliminary Report. If an independent research body is flagging your operation as a regional study site, that's a credibility indicator the bank's risk department can't entirely ignore." "You think it'll matter?" I think it's better than going in with nothing but a good payment record, Paula said, which is still something, but more is better. Okay? Caleb, her voice shifted slightly. You built a profitable operation in 2 years on ground that hadn't produced in almost a decade, with equipment everyone wrote off. I'm not being encouraging, that's just the data. Whatever the bank decides, that's real. I know, he said. After he hung up, he sat with the phone in his hand. He thought about the conversation he'd had with himself in the parking lot of that gas station on Route 9, the evening he'd driven home from Marie's funeral, waiting for permission to fall apart, waiting for something. He hadn't gotten the permission then. He wasn't getting it now either. He put the phone down and picked up the Grayson Agricultural Preliminary Report. He'd read it twice already, but he read it again. The March meeting at Harlow County Bank did not go the way Caleb had feared, and it also did not go the way he'd hoped, which meant it went the way most consequential things go, sideways from every expectation into something entirely its own. Doug Fenn had brought in a second person, a woman from the regional agricultural lending desk named Claire Waverly, who had driven up from the regional office and who turned out to have a much sharper grasp of agricultural operations than Doug. She'd read the materials Caleb provided, including the Grayson Preliminary Report, before he arrived. This study, she said, holding up the report, you consented to participate in it. Yes. And they're coming back in spring for a fuller assessment. That's the plan. She looked at him with the evaluating look of someone who is trying to decide how much weight to give something. The balloon payment provision is in the original loan documents, she said. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. I know it is, Caleb said, but restructuring is within the bank's discretion. She set the report down. I'm going to recommend an extension of the original amortization terms, 7 years from origination, as written, rather than a balloon at 2. She looked at Doug. The operation's performance justifies the original risk assessment, and frankly, the preliminary research flagging is an indicator that's hard to dismiss. Doug nodded slowly. Claire looked back at Caleb. There are conditions. Quarterly reporting, which I'd expect you're already doing in some form, and I want a copy of the Grayson final report when it's published. Done, Caleb said. He drove home with the loan restructuring in his inside jacket pocket. He pulled over once, at the same gas station on Route 9, not because he planned to, but because his hands were shaking slightly on the wheel, and he thought it was better to be parked than driving in that condition. He sat there for a while. Different from the last time. Completely different. He had not lost the farm. He had not lost the farm. He started the truck after a few minutes and drove the rest of the way home. And when he got there, Evan was in the kitchen making a peanut butter sandwich with the focused application of someone performing surgery. How'd it go? Evan asked without looking up. We're okay, Caleb said. Evan looked up then. He read his father's face with those dark, serious eyes. Really okay, or you're saying okay, okay. Really okay. The boy held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, satisfied, and went back to his sandwich. Good, he said. Dale stopped by. He left something in the barn for you. Caleb went to the barn. On the workbench, next to the logbook, Dale had left a paper bag. Inside was a bottle of good bourbon and a note that said, in the old farmer's angular handwriting, for when you have something worth drinking to. Caleb had no idea how Dale knew about the bank meeting. Small towns. He put the bourbon on the shelf above the logbook. He'd open it tonight. Spring came fast that year, the kind of fast that makes farmers nervous because the calendar and the weather rarely agree on the planting window, and there's no negotiating with either. Holt delivered the International Harvester in late March, all 6 cylinders sleeved, crankshaft reground and polished, everything internal rebuilt to a spec that made the machine sound. When Caleb first started it in Holt's yard, like something that had never been neglected a day in its life. Caleb drove it home on a trailer and backed it into position at the end of the row, beside the other 5. 6 tractors, all running. He stood in front of them for a long time. Evan came out of the farmhouse and stood next to him, hands in his hoodie pockets, looking at the row of machines. The afternoon light was doing that particular spring thing where it comes at an angle that makes everything look more significant than usual, and the 6 tractors, cleaned and functional, threw long shadows across the farm lane. "They're all done," Evan said. "Yeah. All 6. All 6. Evan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mom would have thought this was insane." Caleb looked at his son. The boy said it without sadness, or not only sadness, there was something affectionate in it, something that acknowledged Marie's personality directly. "She probably would have," Caleb said. "She also would have helped." Evan smiled a little. "Yeah, she would have." He paused. "She was good at helping with stuff she thought was dumb. She was good at a lot of things." They stood there together for a moment, the way they had at the beginning, in the October dark of that first evening. Except now the farm was different, and they were different, and the machines in front of them ran. "Okay," Evan said finally. "I'm hungry." The moment ended the way moments on working farms usually end. Not dramatically, just naturally, because there was always something else to do. Caleb followed his son inside. Dr. Okafor returned in April with a 3-person research team and spent 4 days on the property doing the comprehensive assessment she'd mentioned. Caleb let them work and answered their questions and otherwise stayed out of their way, which seemed to be what they preferred. On the last day, she sat with him in the kitchen with her laptop and showed him the preliminary data from the full assessment. "Your soil organic matter content has increased faster than we typically see in restored operations," she said. "Usually we project 2 to 3% increase per year in the first rotation cycle. You're running ahead of that." "The compost inputs in year 1, Caleb said. "I probably overdid it." "You didn't." She pulled up a graph. "The amendment rates look aggressive on paper, but given the baseline depletion level of this soil, they were calibrated correctly. It was a good call." "It was a guess," Caleb said honestly. "It was an informed guess that turned out to be right," she said. "In applied agriculture, that's essentially the same thing." She looked at him over the laptop. "We're going to recommend this operation for a feature case study in the regional report. With your consent." Caleb looked at the graphs on her screen, the numbers he'd put into the ground, coming back in data. "You can use it," he said. She packed up her laptop. "Mr. Thornton," she said at the door, "I've assessed a lot of operations. Some of them have better resources than you, better equipment, better initial soil conditions. Most of them don't have better outcomes than what you've built here in 3 years." She paused, the way scientists pause when they're choosing precision over generosity. "I want to be accurate rather than effusive, so I'll say this. What you've accomplished here is well outside the norm. That's not encouragement, that's data." She left. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment. Outside in the afternoon light, the 6 tractors sat in their row. The fields were green, 3 years of work. In the ground, visible. He was still not where he needed to be. Not financially secure, not free of the grinding daily work, not through the kind of season where everything could still go sideways. He knew that. He'd stopped letting himself forget the fragility of what he'd built, because forgetting it was how you stopped being careful. But standing in his doorway on that April afternoon, with the research team's vehicles pulling out of his farm lane and the fields showing green against the pale spring sky, Caleb Thornton allowed himself to feel, for exactly one unguarded moment, the full weight of what he'd done. Not pride. Pride wasn't the right word for it. It was closer to, I held on. I kept going. And it turned into something real. That was enough. That was more than enough. And somewhere on the other side of the country, in an office with a city view she'd stopped noticing, Victoria Sterling was reading the Grayson Agricultural Preliminary Report that had just been released, and she was picking up her phone. "Dana," she said, "book me into Harlow County." Dana booked 2 nights at the only decent hotel in Harlow, which was a regional chain property on the edge of town that was clean and unremarkable and exactly the kind of place Victoria Sterling had stayed in hundreds of times when the work took her somewhere, the work took her. She drove herself from the airport in a rental car, which was not her usual practice. She had a service she used, but she'd told Dana not to arrange a driver for this trip. She wasn't sure why exactly. Something about arriving in a small town in a hired car felt wrong for what this was. Too much signal. She wanted to look first, without anything attached to the looking. She got to Harlow on a Tuesday evening in late May, checked in, ordered food from a diner 2 blocks away that the hotel front desk recommended, and sat at the small desk in her room with her laptop, going through the file one more time. 3 years of material. Land records, crop data, the Grayson study, the equipment timeline, the loan restructuring she'd heard about through a contact in regional agricultural lending. Not the specifics, just the fact of it, which told her the bank had decided the operation was worth keeping. Her research associates' photographs from 2 separate drive-bys. The preliminary data from Okafor's spring assessment, which had been shared in a conference presentation she'd attended remotely. She knew this farm on paper better than she knew most of the operations she'd actually invested in. Tomorrow, she would see it in person. She closed the laptop at 10 and lay in the hotel bed staring at the ceiling for a while before she slept. She was not someone who got nervous about meetings. She'd sat across from enough people with enough money and enough certainty about themselves to have burned through whatever circuits generate nervousness a long time ago. But this was different, and she knew it was different, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that the difference made her slightly uncertain in a way she couldn't entirely account for. She fell asleep still thinking about it. She drove out to Miller Road at 8 the next morning. The directions Dana had found from the county records took her through Harlow and out onto the county roads, and as she turned onto Miller Road itself, she could see the farm from a quarter-mile away. The cleared fields, the organized layout, the barn. She slowed without thinking about it. It looked different from the photographs. Photographs flatten things. They remove depth and scale and the particular quality of light that changes how a place feels when you're standing in it. The photographs she'd studied had shown her the facts of the Miller Road property, the acreage, the equipment, the field layout. What they hadn't shown her was the sense of intention in it. That was the only word she could find for it, driving slowly toward the farm entrance. Intention. Like every decision about where the fence went and how the fields were oriented and where the equipment was positioned had been made by someone who was thinking about more than just getting through the season. Someone who was thinking about what this place was supposed to become. She pulled into the farm lane and stopped. There was a man in the near field, running what looked like one of the larger tractors. She could see from the Grayson Report's equipment appendix it was the Case IH, working a section of ground. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched him work for a moment. There was nothing theatrical about it. He was just working. Moving down the rows with the practiced economy of someone who had done this enough times that the technique had become unconscious, which was itself a kind of testament to the years behind it. She got out of the car. He saw her then, not immediately, but in the way you see things at the edge of your field of vision, and your brain takes a moment to process that something has changed. He slowed the tractor and looked toward the farm lane. She raised a hand. He killed the engine and climbed down. Opat. Caleb Thornton was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly. The file she'd built was full of data and had no photographs of the man himself. She'd formed some picture, the way you always do when you know a lot about someone you've never seen, some composite assembled from the facts and what the facts implied. The man walking toward her across the field was 32, broad through the shoulders, wearing work clothes that had clearly been work clothes for years, rather than purchased for the occasion. His hands, which she noticed because hands told you things, were the hands of someone who worked with them daily. There was a cut on his left knuckle, fresh. His face was harder to read. Not closed, exactly. Careful. The face of someone who had learned to take in information before giving any. "Mr. Thornton," she said when he reached the farm lane. "Yeah." He looked at her with the attentive neutrality of a man who doesn't yet know what he's dealing with. "Can I help you?" "My name is Victoria Sterling. I run an investment group called Sterling Venture. I've been following the development of your operation for about 2.5 years, and I'd like to talk to you about it, if you're willing." She paused. "I should have called ahead. I apologize for that." Caleb looked at her for a moment. A long enough moment that another person might have felt the need to fill it. She didn't. "How'd you find me?" he said. "County land records when you bought the property, then the Grayson study, then everything in between. That's a lot of work for someone who hasn't called ahead. I was waiting to see how things developed before I introduced myself." "And how did they develop?" "Better than I expected," she said. which is saying something. He studied her. She could see him working through it, who she was, what she wanted, how much of this to take at face value. "What does your investment group do?" he said. "Agricultural operations primarily, some adjacent industries. We identify operations with strong fundamentals and unusual potential and provide capital and infrastructure to scale them." "Scale them," he repeated. "Expand them. Take what's working and grow it, with the resources to do it properly." Caleb looked back at his field, at the Case IH sitting idle where he'd stopped it, then back at her. "You want to come see the farm," he said, "if you're willing." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You want coffee?" He made it in the farmhouse kitchen, which was functional and reasonably organized and had the particular feel of a space that a man and a child occupied. A school permission slip on the counter, a pair of small muddy boots by the door, a coffee maker that had been through some use. She sat at the kitchen table, which she noticed still had a ledger book on it, open to a current page, pencil resting in the spine. He set a mug in front of her and sat down across the table. "You said 2.5 years," he said. "Yes." "So since the beginning?" "Close to it. A few months in." "What caught your attention?" She wrapped her hands around the mug. "The land transaction. The price you paid was right for the potential of the property, which told me either you'd done your homework or you were very lucky. Then the equipment auction." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but in that territory. "The tractors. The tractors. Everyone in that room saw scrap. You saw something else." "I saw machines that could be saved." "I know," Victoria said. "That's what caught my attention." He drank his coffee and looked at her directly. Not aggressively, just directly, with the steadiness of a man who had decided to take the measure of something and was doing it. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "I appreciate you coming out, but I want to be straight with you. I've had 2 people this year approach me about the farm, both of them with ideas about what they could do with it. One wanted a minority stake in exchange for an equipment lease at rates that weren't that different from what I could get commercially. The other wanted to buy 50% of the operation, which I'm not interested in." He set his mug down. "So before we walk the farm, I'd like to know what you're actually proposing, because I'd rather have that conversation now than after I've shown you everything." She looked at him. Directness. Real directness, not the performed kind. She'd sat across from a lot of people who led with assertiveness as a negotiating posture. This wasn't that. This was a man who had learned, probably at significant cost, to identify exactly what he needed to know and ask for it. "Fair enough," she said. "What I'm proposing isn't a partial acquisition, and it isn't an equipment lease. What Sterling Venture does is structured partnership. We provide capital, operational resources, access to markets, and infrastructure support. In exchange, we hold a stake in the expanded operation. The structure is negotiated case by case, but the principle is the same. We don't take over and we don't step back. We work alongside." What does alongside mean in practice? It means I'm not farming your fields. It means the operational decisions stay with you. It means the capital and the connections and the market access come from us, but the farm is still your farm. She paused. "I've done this 6 times in the last 4 years. I can give you references from every operator we've partnered with. I'd expect you to call them." "I will," he said simply. "Good." He looked at his ledger, at the pencil line in the spine of it. She had the sense he was thinking about something specific, some calculation he'd made and was now running again in light of this conversation. "Why this farm?" he said. "There are better capitalized operations in this region, better established ones." "Yes," she said. "So why here?" She was quiet for a moment. She had a professional answer to this question, and a true answer, and they overlapped but weren't identical. "Because of what the data shows about what you've built here in 3 years," she said. "The soil metrics, the efficiency ratios, the equipment recovery." She set her mug down. "And because the person who built it did it with resources that would have stopped most people in the first 6 months, and didn't stop. That's not something capital alone creates. That's something you have to already be." She met his eyes. Capital can scale what exists. It can't create the thing that makes scaling worth doing. Caleb was quiet. Outside somewhere, a tractor was... No, not a tractor. Something else. She realized a moment later it was a kid on a bicycle on the farm lane, visible through the kitchen window. "My son," Caleb said, following her look. "How old?" 10. He's been helping on the farm since day one." "The logbook in the barn," she said. "The second one in the kid's handwriting." He looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You've been in the barn?" "I haven't set foot on this property before today," she said. "My research associate drove by twice and photographed from the road. The logbook was visible through the open barn door in one of the photos. I zoomed in." He was quiet for a moment. "You're thorough." "I try to be." He stood up. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the farm." Dad. They walked the property for 2 hours. Caleb walked her through the fields, explaining the rotation logic, the amendment approach, the drainage management. He was not a man who performed when he explained things. He didn't simplify for her or dress the information up. He talked about the farm the way he thought about it, in specific and technical terms, and she kept up without difficulty, asking questions that told him she wasn't there to be impressed by surface things. She stopped in the middle of the north field and crouched, the way Dr. Okafor had crouched, and pressed her fingers into the soil. Held them there for a moment. Rubbed the soil between her fingers, feeling the texture, the moisture content, the structure of it. "The organic matter content," she said. "You got ahead of the projection in the Grayson study." "Dr. Okafor said that." "She's right." Victoria stood up, looking at the field. "This is better soil than it was 3 years ago. That sounds obvious, but it isn't. A lot of operations mine their soil in the early years, build yield numbers at the expense of long-term productivity. You went the other direction." "I wanted to farm this land for a long time," Caleb said. "That changes how you think about the first few years." She looked at him. "How long?" "As long as I can. As long as Evan wants to." She was quiet for a moment. A wind moved through the field, the kind of wind that carries the smell of growing things, and for a few seconds neither of them said anything. "You built all of this because you wanted to be here for a long time," she said. Not a question. "Yeah. That's unusual." "Is it?" "More than you might think," Victoria said. They walked on to the barn. Check. She spent 30 minutes in the barn, looking at the 6 tractors the way Caleb had watched Dale Hutchins look at the Massey Ferguson. Slowly, with the full attention of someone who understood what she was seeing. She walked the row from one end to the other. She didn't touch anything, but she looked at everything. The condition of each machine, the repairs, the obvious age and history in the bodywork, and the evident functionality in the mechanisms. At the Case IH, she stopped the longest. "This is the one that had the seized engine and the caved cab," she said. "Yeah." "You rebuilt it yourself, except the machine work on the crank. Holt in Crestview did the crank. I did everything else." She looked at the engine compartment for a moment, then at the dented cab. "Why didn't you fix the cab?" "Because the cab doesn't make it run," Caleb said, "and I had other priorities." She nodded slowly. "What would it take to fix it?" "Panel work? Couple days if you know what you're doing. I don't know body work. It's on the list." She moved to the end of the row, to the IH, the last one, the one Holt had rebuilt. "This one was the last," she said. "Yeah," she looked at it. "You told Morris Caldwell, the electrician, that you needed all 6 running not because you needed the horsepower, but because you said you would fix them." Caleb looked at her. "How do you know what I told Morris?" "I don't specifically. Morris mentioned it to Dale Hutchins, and Dale mentioned it in a conversation that was included in a local agricultural cooperative newsletter I received. Small town information networks." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been thorough," he said again, but this time there was something in his voice that wasn't quite accusation and wasn't quite amusement, somewhere between the two. "I know," she said. "I'm aware it might feel like an intrusion. It's how I work." She looked at him directly. "I don't bring capital to situations I haven't fully understood first, and I don't fully understand situations without knowing the person at the center of them." "And do you?" Know me? No, she said immediately. I know your operation. I know your decisions. I know what you've done and how you've done it. I don't know you. He considered that. Fair answer. Can I ask you something? You're going to anyway, he said. The bank loan, she said. The restructuring in March. He went still for a fraction of a second, just enough for her to see it. That wasn't in the public record, he said. No, someone in regional agricultural lending mentioned it. Not the details, just the fact of it. I'd have found out eventually, through other means. What about it? You were close to losing this, she said. Not brutally, just accurately. Yeah. And you didn't? No. What would you have done if you had? If the bank had called the loan? He was quiet for a long moment. She didn't rush him. I don't know, he said finally. I didn't let myself think too far down that road. If you start planning for the version where you lose, you start operating like someone who's planning to lose. He paused. So I just worked the problem in front of me. She was quiet. I have a son, he said. I don't have the option of deciding things are too hard. They came back to the farmhouse at noon and found Evan in the kitchen making sandwiches with the territorial confidence of someone who considers the kitchen his domain when his father is outside. He looked at Victoria with the frank, measuring gaze of a 10-year-old who has not yet learned to be polite about assessing strangers. Who are you? He said. Evan, Caleb said. It's fine, Victoria said. She looked at the boy. My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm a business person. I came to look at your farm. Evan processed this. Why? Because I think it's exceptional. Evan looked at his father. She thinks the farm is exceptional. I heard her, Caleb said. That's good, right? Make the sandwiches. Evan turned back to the counter, but she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was listening to everything. The kid had his father's quality of taking in information without appearing to. They ate at the kitchen table. Evan had made 3 sandwiches without being asked, which told her things, and the conversation became less formal in the way conversations do when a child is present and you can't be entirely strategic. Evan asked her questions with the directness of someone who had not been taught that certain questions were inappropriate. Do you farm? He said. No, I invest in farms. What's the difference? Farmers know the land, she said. I know how to find the ones who know the land and make sure they have what they need. Evan thought about this. So you're like a helper? In a sense, yes. My dad doesn't usually like help, Evan said without malice, as a statement of observed fact. Caleb gave his son a look. What? Evan said. You don't. Dale says you're stubborn as bad weather. Dale talks too much. Dale says that too, Evan said. Victoria looked at Caleb. There was something in his expression that she thought might be embarrassment, which was the most human she'd seen him look in the 2 hours they'd spent together. He's not wrong, Caleb said. About Dale talking too much? Evan said. About me being stubborn. Evan shrugged. It's okay. Stubborn is how we fixed all the tractors. Caleb looked at his son. Evan finished his sandwich and took his plate to the sink. After lunch, with Evan having disappeared back outside, Caleb and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and the conversation moved into the territory it had been approaching since she arrived. What are you thinking? Caleb said. In terms of a proposal? Yeah. I need to do formal due diligence before any numbers are on the table. That takes 4 to 6 weeks. I'd bring in my team, go through the financials, the soil data, the market positioning. At the end of that, I'd have a specific proposal in writing. She looked at her coffee. But I can tell you directionally what I'm thinking. Please. The 63 acres is a starting point, not a ceiling. The soil science on this property suggests it can sustain a significantly expanded operation. The adjacent parcels. She'd looked at the county map. There are 3 properties bordering yours that have been in various stages of distress. With capital, you could acquire and bring them into production over a 2 to 3 year period. That doubles your effective acreage and more than doubles your market position because scale matters to the contracts that are worth having. Caleb was listening. His face was attentive and still. The Grayson study is going to generate interest, she continued. That report publishes next spring. When it does, your operation is going to be cited as a regional model case. That's a credibility platform that most operations take decades to develop, and you're going to have it at year 4. She paused. Food companies with direct sourcing programs are going to start calling you. Some of them already have people tracking the Grayson work. I've had one inquiry, Caleb said. From whom? He named the company. Victoria nodded. They're legitimate. They're also not the biggest fish. When the report publishes, you'll hear from bigger ones. The question is whether you'll have the infrastructure to fulfill contracts at the scale they want. And that's where you come in, he said. That's where we come in, she said. Yes. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ledger on the table, at the pencil in the spine of it. She had the sense he was thinking about something she couldn't see. Ms. Sterling, he said. Victoria. Victoria. He said it carefully, the way a careful man uses a name for the first time. I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Why does Sterling Venture want this? Not what the data shows. I understand the data argument. But there are operations with better data, better capitalization, more established infrastructure. Why a 63-acre farm in Harlow County with one operator who rebuilt 6 broken tractors over 3 years? She looked at him for a long moment. She had the professional answer. She'd given part of it already this morning. But he was asking for something more specific than the professional answer, and he would know if she gave him the professional answer again. Because I've been doing this for 6 years, she said slowly, and I've learned that the data tells you what an operation is worth now. It doesn't tell you what it could become. That part, she paused, that part requires judgment, about the person running it, about whether the thing they've built reflects something they understand or something they got lucky with. She looked at him. You didn't get lucky. You built this the way you built it because you understood, correctly, that slow and right beats fast and wrong every time. You understood that the soil matters more than the yield number in year 1. You understood that a tractor that actually works is worth more than 5 that sort of work. She stopped. I've looked at this operation for 2.5 years. I don't see luck. I see someone who sees things clearly and does hard things consistently. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere on the farm, she could hear Evan's bicycle. There's something else, she said. Okay. She'd decided to say this before she arrived, because not saying it felt dishonest, and she was not in the habit of dishonesty in business conversations, because it always cost you more than it saved. I started following this operation because of the data, she said. I've stayed interested in it because, she chose her words, because what you've done here matters to me in a way that goes beyond the investment case. I want to be transparent about that, because it shouldn't affect my judgment, and I've worked to make sure it doesn't, but you should know it. Caleb looked at her. You're going to need to explain that, he said. I built my company from a standing start, she said. Different resources than you. I had capital where you had none, but the same fundamental problem, convincing people that something no one else could see yet was real. Doing the work before there was any evidence it would pay off. She looked at her hands. I know what it costs. I know what you've given up for 3 years. And I watched you do it without... She stopped. Without anyone in your corner, essentially. And you kept going. The kitchen was very quiet. I had Evan, Caleb said. Yes, she said. You did. He was quiet for a while. I'm not making any decisions today, he said. I'm not asking you to. I want to think about this, and I want to call your references. I'd be concerned if you didn't. He looked at her. And I want my accountant in the room when we talk numbers. Paula Devers, Victoria said. Yes, she should be. He paused. You know my accountant's name. She was in the county agricultural newsletter too, Victoria said. Different article. For the first time that day, Caleb Thornton actually smiled. It was a small one and slightly rueful, but it was real. You're very thorough, he said for the 3rd time. I've been told. She drove back to the hotel that evening and sat at the small desk again, not with the laptop this time, but with her own notebook. She still kept one, a habit from her early years she'd never broken. She She wrote notes from the day, the soil condition, the equipment, the field layout, the conversation. She stopped and looked at what she'd written for a while. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the page, 2 words that she didn't usually put in professional notes. He's real. She looked at that for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed. The due diligence process took 5 weeks. Victoria's team came through Harlow twice during that period. Paul Garrett for the financial review, an agronomist named Dr. Way for an independent soil and operational assessment, and a market analyst who spent 2 days looking at the regional and national positioning of the operation relative to direct source food contracts. Caleb cooperated fully and said almost nothing to anyone in Harlow about what was happening, which was its own kind of remarkable in a town where information moved the way it did. He told Paula, who needed to know. He told Dale, because Dale asked him directly one morning at the farm, and Caleb had long since determined that being straight with Dale was the only reasonable policy. Dale listened to the summary version without interruption. Sterling Venture Group, Dale said when Caleb was done. I looked them up. Of course you did. 6 agricultural partnerships in 4 years, all of them still running. None of the operators walked away. He paused. That's not nothing. No, Caleb said. It's not. What's she offering, roughly? We're not at numbers yet. Dale nodded. But you're going to hear them. Yeah. The old farmer looked out at the fields. The town's going to hear about this, he said. You know that. I know. People who laughed at those tractors are going to have to decide what to do with themselves. Caleb said nothing. Dale turned and looked at him directly. You're going to handle that right, he said. It wasn't a question. What do you mean? I mean, when this becomes real, when the number comes out and the town figures out what you built here, there'll be a temptation to let people feel bad about what they said. The ones who called you crazy. The ones who waited to see you fail. He paused. Don't. Caleb looked at him. Not because they deserve grace they didn't show you, Dale said, but because you're going to need this community for as long as you're farming in it, and because the kind of man who gloats at the people who doubted him isn't the kind of man who builds something that lasts. He picked up his hat. I've watched a few people have a moment like the one you're about to have. The ones who handle it right go further. He left. Caleb stood in the barn for a while. Then he went to find Evan, because it was a Saturday, and Evan had been asking for 3 weeks if they could fix the cab on the Case IH, and Caleb had decided it was time to learn bodywork. Tick. The proposal from Sterling Venture Group arrived on a Tuesday morning in July, delivered by courier to Paula Devers' office, where Caleb met her to open it. Paula read through it first, systematically, making notes, while Caleb sat across from her desk and waited. He'd learned, in the 3 years of farming and the months of this process, that waiting was a skill. You either developed it or you lost yourself to the version of the thing you imagined, which was always less accurate than the version that was actually in front of you. Paula finished reading. She set the document down and looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. The valuation, she said, is $112 million. The room was very quiet. Caleb looked at her. For the operation. For the operation, including projected expansion acreage and the contracted market position. It's not 63 acres they're valuing, it's what 63 acres becomes under the partnership framework. She paused. It's a legitimate valuation. I'll want to take it to an independent assessor, but the methodology is sound. He looked at the document, at his farm's name on the cover page. Caleb Thornton had $43 in his bank account the day he stood in that field with 6 rusted tractors behind him. The stake they're taking, he said. Walk me through it. She did. It was structured fairly. A minority stake in the expanded operation. Governance provisions that kept operational control with Caleb, exit clauses on both sides that protected him if the partnership didn't work. It was, Paula said carefully, the kind of document you got from people who intended to actually be partners. What do you think? He said. She took her glasses off. I think you should talk to her references. I think you should take a week and sit with the implications. And I think... She paused, which was unusual for Paula, who did not generally pause. I think you built something that deserved a moment like this, and I'm glad it came. He looked at the document. $112 million. He thought about the gas station on Route 9. He thought about the farm lane in October 3 years ago, Evan's hand in his, 6 broken machines in the dark. He thought about Marie, who would have thought this was insane and would have been right there beside him anyway. He picked up the document. "I'll call the references today," he said. He said yes on a Thursday, 2 weeks later, sitting across from Victoria Sterling in Paula's conference room with the signed agreement between them on the table. The town of Harlow found out the following Monday when the county business registry filing went public. A standard legal requirement. Nothing Caleb had done to announce it. The number was in the filing. $112 million partnership agreement. Miller Road property. Caleb Thornton. By Monday afternoon, it had reached every coffee table, every feed store counter, every back booth, and every diner in Harlow County. Gary Meeks called him. Brett Calloway, the insurance man from Evan's birthday party, left a message that Caleb chose not to return that week. Several people he barely knew called to congratulate him with the specific enthusiasm of people who are recalibrating a position they'd held strongly and don't want to examine that process too directly. He was patient with all of it. He was not cold. He was not gloating. He was not the version of himself that had imagined, in his darker moments in the barn at 1 a.m, telling certain people certain things. He was just quiet and steady and focused on what came next, which was, as it had always been, the work. The day after the filing went public, he was back on the Case IH at 7 a.m, working the fields that needed working, because the partnership was signed, but the crop didn't care about the partnership, and the season didn't wait for the town to catch up with the news. Evan packed his own lunch that morning and biked out to the field at noon to eat it with his father. "People at school are saying stuff," the boy said, sitting on the rear tire of the idling tractor. "What kind of stuff?" "About the money. The deal. Tyler Buckley said his dad said you were a millionaire now." "That's not exactly how it works," Caleb said. "How does it work?" "It means the farm is worth that. Not that I have that in a bank account." Evan thought about this. "But it's still a lot." "Yeah, it's still a lot." "Are you happy?" Evan asked. Caleb looked at his son, at the fields around them, at the farm that had been dead ground 3 years ago and was now something that a team of professionals had assessed and valued and determined was worth more than most people in Harlow County would earn in several lifetimes combined. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Evan ate his sandwich. "Good," he said. "Can we get a dog now?" Caleb looked at him. "Evan? It's been 2 years since I asked. 2.5. So that's basically 3, and a farm definitely needs a—" "Get your bike," Caleb said. "I've got 2 hours of work left." Evan hopped off the tire, grinning. "I'm going to take that as a yes," he said. He biked back toward the barn. Caleb sat on the Case IH for a moment, looking at the field in front of him. Then he put it in gear and kept going. They got the dog in August. It was Evan's idea, which it had always been, and the execution was characteristically Evan. He researched breeds for 3 weeks, made a spreadsheet that Caleb discovered on the kitchen table one morning, and read with the specific mixture of amusement and recognition that his son frequently produced in him, and announced with complete confidence that what the farm needed was an Australian shepherd, because they were working dogs. They were smart, and they were, in Evan's words, scientifically correct for a farm this size. Caleb read the spreadsheet. It was actually a pretty solid analysis. They drove to a farm outside Delwood on a Saturday morning and came home with a 4-month-old blue Merle that Evan named Scout without consultation, and that immediately made itself at home by chewing through one of Caleb's work gloves and then looking enormously pleased with itself. "That's a working dog," Caleb said, looking at the destroyed glove. "She's learning," Evan said, already on the floor letting the dog climb on him. "She's learning the wrong things." "Dad!" Evan looked up at him with the particular expression that meant he considered the matter settled. "She's perfect." She was not perfect. She was chaotic and loud and had strong opinions about where she was and wasn't allowed to be, which differed significantly from Caleb's opinions on the same subject. But she was also, within 2 weeks, running alongside the tractors in the field in the morning with an energy that made Evan laugh every time. and sleeping at the foot of his bed at night and following Caleb through the barn with a focused attention that made him think she actually was going to turn into something useful eventually. He stopped arguing about the gloves. The partnership with Sterling Venture Group became operational in the fall, and nothing about it was simple, which Caleb had expected, and everything about the complexity was manageable, which he had hoped but not been certain of. The expansion plan called for acquiring 2 of the 3 adjacent distressed parcels that Victoria had identified, a combined 81 acres that, when added to the original 63, brought the total operational footprint to 144 acres. The third parcel was still in a legal dispute between family members and wasn't going to be available in any near-term time frame. The acquisition process for the 2 available parcels took 4 months of negotiation, one of them straightforward, one of them complicated by a lien that required resolution before the title could transfer. Caleb sat through more legal and financial meetings in those 4 months than in the previous 3 years combined. He came home from some of them with his jaw set and his patience visibly at the end of its rope, which Evan had learned to read and Scout had developed her own response to, which involved sitting on his feet until he acknowledged her. "The lean thing is killing me," he told Dale one morning, standing in the barn. "Legal things always take longer than you think," Dale said. "Victoria's team is handling most of it, but every week it drags out is a week I'm not getting that ground prepared for spring." "What does Victoria say?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She says it'll resolve, that her team has seen this before and it resolves." "Do you believe her?" He considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Dale looked at him with the directness he'd always brought to conversations with Caleb, which was one of the things Caleb valued most about the man. "Good," Dale said. "Then let her handle it and go work your ground." It resolved in February. Both parcels transferred in March, 2 weeks before planting. Caleb stood on the new ground the morning after the title cleared, cold still, the soil not yet ready, the land showing its years of neglect in the tangled growth and the compaction you could feel when you pushed a foot into it. He'd stood on ground like this before. He knew what it looked like before it became something else. He walked the perimeter of both parcels that morning. He was alone, just him and Scout trotting alongside. He didn't take notes or photographs. He just walked and looked and thought. Then he went back to the barn, pulled the John Deere out, and started on the field preparation. The first tractor he'd ever fixed. Still running. The Grayson Agricultural Study published in the spring, and it did what Victoria had said it would do. The Miller Road operation appeared as the featured regional case study, 43 pages of data, methodology, and analysis that to a general reader might have read as dry academic material, but to anyone in the agricultural industry read as a serious endorsement of an approach that was producing results that didn't match the expected curve for a restoration operation of its size and age. Within 3 weeks of publication, Caleb had received 14 inquiries from food companies interested in direct sourcing contracts. Victoria's team fielded most of the initial contact, which was part of what having a team meant, and which Caleb was still adjusting to. The reality that he was no longer entirely alone in the management of this thing, that there were people whose job was to handle the parts he used to handle badly, because he had to handle everything. He still handled more than he probably should have. He was working on it. The contract that came through in May was the one that mattered most. A regional direct sourcing agreement with a food company called Clearfield Natural Foods, not the largest company that had inquired, but the one with the best terms and the most aligned values around how the farming was actually done. Clearfield wanted to know how their suppliers farmed. They'd sent people to walk the fields before any contract conversation happened, and the people they'd sent had spoken to Caleb in a way that made it clear they were looking at methods, not just yield numbers. He liked that. The contract covered a 5-year period and guaranteed purchasing volume that, for the first time in the history of the Miller Road operation, made the financial planning genuinely stable. Not comfortable, well, farming was never exactly comfortable, but stable. The kind of stable where you could make decisions based on what was right for the land rather than what was necessary for this month's cash flow. He called Paula after the contract was signed. "We're okay," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. You are. I mean, actually, okay. I know what you mean, Caleb. He sat in the farmhouse kitchen with the phone in his hand after they hung up. Same table, same kitchen. The ledger was still there, current page still open, pencil in the spine. He'd thought about moving to a digital system and had even tried it briefly at Victoria's team's suggestion, and had gone back to the ledger inside of a month because the paper was honest in a way the screen wasn't. When you wrote a number in ink, you had to mean it. He looked at the current page. The column on the right was larger than it had ever been. Not extravagantly, not obscenely, but solidly, undeniably, in a way that did not require checking twice. He closed the ledger and went outside. Victoria came back to Harlow in June, the first anniversary of the partnership agreement, and it was different from her first visit in the way things are different when you've crossed from the edge of something into the middle of it. She'd been out 4 times in the intervening year, twice for operational check-ins, once for the Clearfield contract discussion, once in the fall when Caleb had a problem with the expansion field drainage that required a decision about infrastructure investment that was above the threshold he could make alone. Each visit had been professional and purposeful and had involved a lot of time in fields and in meeting rooms and on the phone with her team. This visit was different because she'd asked to come without an agenda item, which was unusual enough for her that Paul Garrett had asked if everything was all right when she told him. "Everything's fine," she'd said. "I just want to see how it's going." "We get quarterly reports," Paul said. "I know. And monthly calls." "Paul." She'd given him the look that meant the conversation was over. She drove herself again in the same rental car from the same airport and pulled into the Miller Road farm lane on a Tuesday morning in June to find Caleb on the expansion ground with the IH, the last tractor, Holt's rebuild, running a cultivation pass on a section he was preparing for a late planting. Scout saw her first and came tearing across the field at a speed that suggested she was not so much greeting visitors as auditing them. She circled Victoria twice and then sat down and looked at her with the intense focus of an Australian shepherd who has decided to take this seriously. "You must be Scout," Victoria said. Scout's tail moved once, assessment complete. Caleb shut the engine off and walked over. He looked different from a year ago, she thought. Not dramatically. He was still the same quiet, careful man, still wore the same expression that took its time deciding things. But there was something less tightly wound in it, something that had, if not relaxed exactly, at least settled. "No agenda?" he said. "No agenda," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the same directness that had characterized every conversation they'd had. "You want to walk the expansion ground?" "Yeah." They walked it for an hour. He talked about what he'd found in the soil of the new parcels. Different from the original 63 lower organic matter, more compaction history, requiring a different approach in the first rotation. He talked about the drainage modification they'd put in on the north section in March, which had already shown a measurable improvement in the spring soil temperature profile. She listened and asked questions and was aware, not for the first time, that the thing she found most interesting about Caleb Thornton was not the operation's financials, or its market position, or its soil metrics. It was the way he talked about the land. Not romantically. He wasn't a man who romanticized things. That quality had probably been worked out of him by the years, or maybe he'd never had it. He talked about the land the way you talked about something you were responsible for, something that had its own needs and its own logic, and your job was to understand those things well enough to work with them rather than against them. That was rarer than it should have been in her experience. At the edge of the original 63 acres, where the farm lane met the newer ground, they stopped. The afternoon light was doing what it did in June in Harlow County, which was to come in at an angle that made the growing fields look like they were lit from inside. "A year," she said. "Yeah. How does it feel?" He considered the question. "Like I've been doing this for a long time, and also like I'm just getting started," he said, which is probably accurate. "It is," she said. He looked at the fields. "Victoria." "Yeah. I've been thinking about something and I want to say it directly." "Okay. When you came last year, you said you'd been watching this place for 2.5 years because of the data, and then you said there was something else." He looked at her. "I didn't push on it then. I'm pushing on it now." She held his gaze. "I think you know what it was," she said. "I think I might. but I'd like to hear you say it. She looked at the fields for a moment, at the farm that had been dead ground 4 years ago and was now 144 acres of working land with a 5-year contract and soil that was improving every season, and a published research case study, an evaluation that had started at 112 million and was going to be higher when they ran the numbers again in the fall. I was lonely, she said. In the specific way that you're lonely when you've built something by yourself for a long time and there aren't very many people who understand what that costs. She paused. And then I found this file about a man in Harlow County who was doing something everyone said was impossible, by himself, at considerable cost, and refusing to stop. And She stopped, started again. I recognized it, that's all. The field moved in the light wind. That's not all, Caleb said. She looked at him. It's not all, he said again. Not pushing, just accurate. No, she said. It's not all. They stood there for a moment. I'm not good at this, she said. I want to be honest about that. At what? At... She gestured vaguely, which was uncharacteristic of her. This, whatever this is. I'm not either, he said. For the record. I know. Evan will have opinions. Evan already has opinions about everything. He'll have more about this. She almost smiled. I know. Caleb looked at the field. We could take it slow, he said. See what it is. That seems reasonable, she said. You should know I'm not easy to be around when I'm in the middle of a planting window. I've gathered, and I work long hours. Caleb. She looked at him directly. I run a venture group. I worked 16-hour days for 6 years to build it. I'm not going to be intimidated by your schedule. He looked at her for a moment. Fair enough, he said. Scout came trotting back from wherever she'd been investigating and sat down between them, looking from one to the other with the expression of a dog who has assessed the situation and finds it satisfactory. Caleb looked down at her. Mind your business, he said. Scout wagged her tail. The scholarship program started in the fall, and it started, like most of the good things in Caleb's life, without a grand plan. He'd been at Harlow Elementary for a school event, the kind Evan still dragged him to with the authority of a child who considers parental attendance non-negotiable, and had run into a woman named Janet Fielding who taught agricultural science at the high school and who had the particular energy of a person doing meaningful work with inadequate resources. They'd talked for 20 minutes in the school hallway, and by the end of it, Caleb knew 3 things: that Janet was a good teacher, that her program was underfunded, and that there were kids in Harlow County who wanted to go into agriculture and didn't have the means to get there. He went home and thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he called Paula and asked her to set up a fund. The Thornton Agricultural Scholarship. He'd spent 10 minutes on the name and then given up and just used his own, which felt uncomfortable but was the honest choice. Provided full tuition support for Harlow County students pursuing agricultural science or related fields. The first year, 3 students received it. The second year, 6. He didn't announce it. The county newspaper found out and wrote a story, which he'd asked them to keep brief, and they'd mostly complied. The responses he got from the 3 scholarship students in the first year were the kind of letters he put in a folder in the kitchen drawer and didn't take out often because they made him feel things in his chest that didn't have good outlets on a working farm. Dale heard about it and showed up at the barn the following Saturday. The scholarship, Dale said. Yeah. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have made a big thing of it. Dale looked at him. I would have made an appropriate thing of it. Same thing? Dale was quiet for a moment. It's a good use of money, he said, which was as close to effusive as the man got. It's not that much money, Caleb said. It's enough money for 3 kids who didn't have it to now have it, Dale said. That's the definition of enough money. They stood in the barn for a moment. How are your knees? Caleb said. Bad, Dale said. How's your back? Bad. Farming, Dale said. Farming, Caleb agreed. Evan turned 12 in the summer of the partnership's second year, and the birthday party at the farm was a different kind of event from the rough affair 2 years before. Not because Caleb had made it elaborate, He hadn't, specifically, but because the farm itself was different now, and the people who came were different, and the occasion had a different weight. Dale came. Paula came. Janet Fielding from the high school came with her husband. Dr. Okafor, who had maintained a professional relationship with the farm that had developed a genuine warmth at its edges, came with her research team's regards and a letter of congratulations that she delivered in person because she happened to be in the region for a conference. Victoria came. She and Evan had developed, over the preceding year, a relationship that Caleb observed with the careful attention of a father who is trying to understand something he doesn't entirely have the vocabulary for. It wasn't a mother and son thing. Evan was too old and too clear-eyed for that, and Victoria was too direct to pretend otherwise. It was something more sideways than that. Evan talked to her about the farm, and about school, and about his logbook, which he showed her with the pride of an author showing a completed manuscript. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, which Evan, who had developed strong opinions about whether adults were actually listening or just performing listening, had noticed and approved of. At the party, Caleb watched the two of them sitting at a picnic table together, while the other kids ran around the field, Evan showing her his latest entries in the logbook, Victoria reading them with her reading glasses on. She'd started needing them recently and was still slightly annoyed about it, asking questions. Ruth appeared at his elbow. "She's good," Ruth said quietly. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Marie would have liked her." He looked at his mother-in-law. It was the kind of thing that could have gone several wrong ways said wrong at the wrong moment. Ruth said it exactly right. "I think so too," he said. Ruth patted his arm once, the same way she had at Evan's 9th birthday, and went to get a piece of cake. The operation expanded again in the 3rd year of the partnership, this time not in acreage but in product. Victoria had identified a regional market gap in certified sustainable grain supply that the Clearfield contract positioned them to move into. And after 6 months of planning, soil certification, revised growing protocols, a new storage facility that required a real capital investment, the Miller Road operation shipped its first certified sustainable grain lot in October. The price premium was significant. The paperwork was enormous. Caleb spent 3 weeks in September feeling like he was farming paperwork rather than land, which he said to Victoria on the phone one evening with an irritation he'd stopped trying to conceal around her. "The certification process is a one-time investment," she said. "That's easy to say when you're not the one filling out the forms." "I filled out considerably more forms than you to build this company," she said. "I know." "So, I know," he said again. "I'm still allowed to be annoyed." "Yes," she said. "But finish the forms." He finished the forms. The first certified sustainable lot shipped on a Tuesday in October, and Caleb watched the truck pull out of the farm lane from the doorway of the barn, Scout sitting beside him, both of them watching until it turned onto Miller Road and disappeared. He thought about the first harvest, the one that had gone sideways in 3 distinct ways, the combine that broke down, the moisture content problem, the 2 tractors that failed in solidarity. That harvest had turned a small profit that he'd stared at in a ledger like it was something miraculous. This was different. This was the thing built from that first harvest. Layers of work and decision and stubbornness and occasionally luck, stacked 3 years deep into a moment where a truck carrying certified sustainable grain pulled out of his farm lane on a Tuesday morning, and it was completely, entirely normal. That was the strange thing about building something slowly. At some point, the thing you were building became the thing that was, and the distance from where you started was so enormous that you couldn't always feel it. You just lived in what you'd made. He went back to work. On a Saturday evening in early November, Caleb brought Dale's bourbon out of the barn. He'd kept it up on the shelf above the logbook for 2.5 years. Dale had left it with a note that said, "For when you have something worth drinking to," and for 2.5 years Caleb had looked at it and thought, not yet, not yet, not quite yet. He wasn't entirely sure what had changed today specifically. There was no single event. The certified sustainable shipment had gone out. The scholarship fund had just processed its 3rd cohort. The expansion ground was showing soil improvement metrics that Dr. Okafor had described in her latest correspondence as ahead of all reasonable projections. The operation was profitable, genuinely and sustainably profitable, in a way that no longer required the careful breath-holding of someone who knows the next season could undo everything. It wasn't one thing. It was everything, accumulated, finally weighing enough to tip the scale from not yet to now. He took the bottle out to the row of 6 tractors. They stood in the farm lane the way they always had, in the order he'd fixed them, which was also roughly the order he'd learned everything he now knew. The John Deere first, then the Massey Ferguson with its welded block, the Ford with its hydraulic mystery, the Case with its seized engine and caved cab. The cab was fixed now, had been for a year, though you could still see the slight irregularity in the panel if you knew to look. The IH at the end, Holt's rebuild, the last one. He looked at them in the evening light. Scout sat beside him. Then Evan appeared from the farmhouse because Evan always knew when something was happening and came and stood on his other side. "What are you doing?" Evan said. "Thinking about drinking a glass of bourbon." Evan looked at the bottle. "That's Dale's bourbon. He gave it to me 2.5 years ago." "I know. I've seen it on the shelf." "I know you've seen it." Evan looked at the tractors. He was 12 now. The boy's face had started to lose some of its roundness, and sometimes when Caleb looked at him from certain angles, he caught a glimpse of the person Evan was becoming, which was strange and moving in the particular way that watching your child move toward their own life is always strange and moving. "Is now the right time?" Evan asked. "I think so," Caleb said. Evan was quiet for a moment. "Because of the shipment?" "Because of everything," Caleb said. They stood together looking at the 6 tractors. "Do you remember the first night?" Evan said. "When we drove out here and looked at them. You just bought them. They were all broken." "I remember." "I was scared," Evan said. He said it simply, without embarrassment, the way he said most things. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to be more stressed, but I was scared we were going to lose everything." Caleb looked at his son. "I was scared too," he said. Evan looked at him. "Really?" "Yeah, a lot of the time." "You didn't seem it." "I worked at not seeming it," Caleb said, "because you needed me to not seem it." He paused. "But scared and doing the thing anyway, that's not the same as not scared." Evan thought about this for a while. "Mom used to say that," he said, "about being brave. She said it wasn't about not being scared." "Yeah," Caleb said. "She was right about most things." They stood in the quiet for a moment. "Do you miss her?" Evan said. "Every day." "Me too." A pause. "But it's different now. It's more like she's part of all of this, you know? Like she's in the farm somehow." Caleb looked at the fields, at the dark soil and the fence lines and the barn, at the work of 4 years visible in everything around him. "Yeah," he said. "I know exactly what you mean." Footsteps on the farm lane behind them. Victoria, coming from the farmhouse where she'd been on a call with her team. She looked at the 2 of them standing by the tractors and slowed, reading the moment the way she'd gotten better at reading moments. "Am I interrupting?" she said. "No," Caleb said. "Come here." She came and stood with them. Scout moved to lean against her leg, which the dog had decided was an acceptable position several months ago. "Dale's bourbon," Victoria said, seeing the bottle. "Finally," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. He opened the bottle and poured into the 3 small glasses he'd brought out from the kitchen. 2 full ones and one with barely a splash, which he handed to Evan. Evan looked at it. "I'm 12. "I know," Caleb said. "1 sip. It's a ceremony." Evan considered this and accepted the glass with the gravity of someone receiving a responsibility. They stood in front of the 6 tractors. Caleb looked at the row of machines. He thought about the auction, about $4,800, and a room full of people who saw scrap. About the barn in December with the space heater that worked 60% of the time, and his hands that didn't know yet what they'd learned to do. About Evan handing him tools in the right order, the boy's memory being better than his own. About Dale, who showed up one day because he wanted to see if there was something to it. About Morris and his gray eyes and his statement that he could fix anything electrical. About Paula, who'd been on his side since before there was any obvious reason to be. About Ruth, who had grieved the same person he had and kept showing up anyway. About Marie, who was not here and who was somehow in everything. He thought about the $43. He thought about the gas station on Route 9, parked in the rain, waiting for permission. He raised his glass. He didn't make a speech. That wasn't who he was. He just raised it, and Victoria raised hers. And Evan raised his with both hands in extreme seriousness, and they stood there for a moment in the November evening light in front of 6 restored tractors and 144 acres of working land. He drank. The bourbon was good, better than he'd expected, though he supposed Dale wouldn't have left bad bourbon. Evan made a face. "That's horrible," Evan said. "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "It's an acquired taste." "Why do people acquire it?" "Takes time," Caleb said. "Most things do." Evan looked at his glass with the expression of someone reconsidering a life choice. "I think I'll acquire a different taste," he said. Victoria laughed, a real one, the kind that came out before she could evaluate it, which was the kind Caleb had come to value specifically because it was rare and genuine. "Smart," she said. Evan handed his glass back to his father and looked at the tractors. "We should put a sign on them," he said, "or something, so people know." "Know what?" Caleb said. "What they were before, and what they became." He paused. "It seems like that should be remembered." Caleb looked at the machines. The John Deere had been the first. The one he'd been most afraid of in the beginning, because everything had depended on whether it could be saved, and he hadn't yet known whether he was the right person to save it. He'd found out. He'd found out that he was, with enough time and enough mistakes and enough willingness to go back under the machine one more time. That was the thing that nobody could have given him and nobody could have taken from him. Not the valuation, not the contract, not the grace and study, the knowing that he could do the thing. That had been the point all along, he thought, though he couldn't have articulated it at the beginning. The tractors were never just tractors. They were the question he was asking himself, repeated 6 times over 3 years, and every time the engine turned over, the answer was the same. Yes. You can. Keep going. "We'll figure something out," Caleb said. He put his arm around Evan's shoulder. His son leaned into him the way he had since he was very small, the particular lean of someone who trusts completely that the thing they're leaning on will hold. It would hold. It had held through everything. Victoria stood on his other side, not leaning, just present, the way she was present, attentively, without pretense, with the quality of genuine attention that he'd come to understand was not just how she did business, but how she did everything. She was looking at the tractors with the expression she got when she was thinking carefully about something and hadn't decided yet whether to say it. "What?" he said. She glanced at him. "Just thinking." "About?" "About how none of the things that mattered were the things that were supposed to matter," she said. "At the beginning, the valuation wasn't the point, the contract wasn't the point. Even the soil metrics weren't the point." She looked at the row of machines. "It was always just this, whether the person at the center of it was going to hold." "And?" Caleb said. She looked at him. "You held," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the ways he'd almost not held. The nights when the numbers didn't work, the bank letter in February, the hydraulic line that took 4 wrong guesses to find, the moments of doubt that he'd never described to anyone, including Ruth, including Dale, that he'd just sat with at the kitchen table at midnight and then taken back to the barn in the morning. Those moments were real. They were as real as the contracts and the soil data and the valuation. They were maybe more real because they were the moments where everything could have ended and didn't, not because of luck, but because he'd decided each time that stopping wasn't something he was going to do. "Yeah," he said. "I held." Scout barked at something in the field, some small animal invisible in the dusk, and took off at speed, and Evan immediately yelled after her with the authority of a boy who knows his dog is not going to listen. And the evening broke open into the ordinary chaos of a working farm at the end of a day, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. Caleb watched his son run after the dog in the failing light. He looked at the tractors one more time, 6 machines that everyone said were finished. He thought about what Evan had said, that they should be remembered. what they were before and what they became. He thought that was right. He thought that was the whole story, actually, reduced to its simplest form. Things that looked finished that weren't. Ground that looked dead that wasn't. A man that a town wrote off who hadn't written himself off. The things that survive the being counted out. The things that come back from it, changed but intact. The things that turn out to be not what they appeared in the worst moment. Not scrap, not failure, not a dead end, but the beginning of something that nobody could see yet except the person who refused to stop looking. That was worth remembering. That was worth putting a sign on. He poured the last of Dale's bourbon onto the ground in front of the John Deere, which felt right in a way he didn't need to explain to anyone, and picked up the glasses and walked back toward the farmhouse where the lights were on, and Evan was somewhere in the dusk calling for a dog who would come back when she was ready and not before. He was not a man who had arrived anywhere final. He knew that. The expansion ground still needed 2 more years of soil work before it would perform the way the original 63 did. The certification paperwork would generate more paperwork. The Clearfield contract had a renewal negotiation in year 3 that would require his full attention. The scholarship fund needed a governance structure he hadn't built yet. There were 4 more years on the loan. The case cab still had a panel irregularity if you knew to look. There was always more to do. That had never been the problem. He stepped onto the porch and turned back once, the way he sometimes did, to look at the farm in the dark. The shapes of the tractors in the lane, the fields beyond them, invisible now but there, growing, alive in the way that ground with good soil and good management grows. Slowly, deliberately, building something underground before anything shows above the surface. Patient work. The only kind that lasted. He went inside. The door closed behind him, and the farm went on in the dark the way farms do. Quiet and working. Holding everything it had been given, preparing for the morning.